Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. In the year 1653, workers digging near a church in the town of Tournai made a discovery that would echo across centuries. Their shovels struck something hard, not stone, metal, gold. As they cleared away the earth, treasures emerged from the darkness, where they had rested for more than 1100 years. A golden signet ring, a sword with garnet inlays, a purse filled with more than 100 golden coins, and scattered throughout the burial, gleaming in the pale northern light, 300 golden insects, bees, their wings spread in eternal flight, crafted with such delicate skill that even after a millennium in the earth, their tiny forms seemed ready to take wing. This was the tomb of Childeric, king of the Franks, father of Clovis, founder of a dynasty that would transform the face of Europe. The grave goods spoke of wealth and power, but they whispered something else as well. They told of a people standing at the threshold between two worlds, between the pagan past and the Christian future, between the dying light of Rome and something new struggling to be born. Tonight, we journey into that threshold time. We will walk with warriors, whose long hair marked them as sacred kings, witness battles fought in rain and blood, and trace the transformation of a barbarian tribe into the founders of France itself. We will meet queens whose rivalries would drench generations in blood, kings who balanced between two faiths, and the slow, inexorable shift of power that would reshape Western civilization. May I ask for your help? Liking and subscribing takes just a moment, but makes a huge difference for the channel. I'm grateful for your consideration. I'm also always amazed by our international reach, so I'd appreciate hearing where you're joining from and your local time. As the present fades to whispers, we find ourselves transported to the forests and rivers of northern Gaul in the 5th century after the death of Christ, where morning mist clings to the Rhine and the Roman world crumbles like old parchment. Tomb in Tournai. The earth keeps its secrets well. For 11 centuries, the soil of Tournai held its treasure in silence, waiting through the rise and fall of dynasties, through wars that reshaped Europe, through plagues and famines, and the slow turning of seasons without number. The Cathedral of St. Brice stood above, its bells marking the hours, its stones weathered by rain and wind, and beneath it all, beneath the prayers and processions and the footsteps of the faithful, gold gleamed in the darkness. When the workers found it, they could not have known what they had stumbled upon. Perhaps they thought it merely another rich burial, another forgotten noble from some distant age. But the signet ring told a different story. Pressed into the gold was an image, a profile, and surrounding it, letters in Latin, Childeric Regis, Childeric the King. And suddenly, the fragments of the past arranged themselves into a name, a face, a moment. This was Childeric of the Franks, who died in the year 481, when the Western Roman Empire itself had only 5 years left to live. Picture the moment of burial. It would have been a grey day, perhaps, the kind of day when the sky and the earth seem to merge into a single, colourless expanse. The Franks would have gathered, warriors in their prime, their hair flowing long and free as custom demanded. They would have lowered their king into the earth with all the wealth he would need in the afterlife. The sword, because a Frank was always a warrior first. The coins, more than 100 of them, gold and solidi, minted by the Romans, whose empire Childeric had both served and exploited. The purse fittings, decorated with garnets that caught the light like drops of frozen blood. And the bees, 300 golden bees, their significance now lost to us, but clearly sacred to those who placed them there. The earth was shoveled back, the mound was raised, and then time did what time does. Grass grew over the barrow, children played where a king slept. Buildings rose and fell. The cathedral was built, its foundations sinking deep, coming to rest almost directly above the forgotten tomb. The Franks themselves transformed, generation by generation, until they were no longer Franks at all but Frenchmen, speaking a Romance tongue instead of Germanic, worshipping in churches instead of sacred groves, barely remembering the long-haired kings who had founded their realm. But the earth remembered, and in 1653 it gave up its secret. The treasure was brought before the court of Leopold William, Archduke of Austria, and Governor of the Spanish Netherlands. Scholars examined the ring, traced the letters, consulted old chronicles. Gregory of Tours had written of Childeric. The Liber Historiae Francorum mentioned him. Slowly, the pieces came together. This was not just any Frankish chieftain. This was the father of Clovis, the man who would unite the Frankish tribes and forge them into a kingdom. This was the beginning of the Merovingian dynasty, the long-haired kings who ruled Francia for nearly 3 centuries. The bees would fly again, in a manner of speaking. More than 1,000 years after Childeric's death, Napoleon Bonaparte would see the golden insects and recognize in them a symbol older than the fleur-de-lis, a symbol that connected him to the deepest roots of French kingship. He would scatter those ancient bees across his coronation robes, reaching back across the centuries to claim legitimacy from a barbarian king sleeping beneath a Belgian church. But that was still far in the future. For now, let us travel back beyond Napoleon, beyond the cathedral, beyond even the moment of Childeric's burial. Let us go back to a time when the Franks were not yet kings of anything, when they were simply one more Germanic tribe pressing against the borders of Rome, drawn by the warmth and wealth of the south, hungry for land and glory, and a place to call their own. The people of the river, they came from the forests of the north, from lands where winter lasted half the year, and the sun, when it appeared at all, hung low and pale in the southern sky. The Franks. The name meant, perhaps, the fierce ones, or the free ones, or the bold ones. Language shifts and blurs across centuries, and the Germanic tongues from which the Franks drew their name are not the same as modern German, but fierce they certainly were. Free they considered themselves, and bold enough to challenge Rome itself. In the beginning, they were not one people, but many, small tribes gathered around charismatic leaders, each with their own territories along the Rhine frontier, each with their own customs and loyalties. The Salian Franks dwelt in the low country, near the river's mouth, where the land dissolved into marsh and estuary. The Ripuarian Franks held the middle Rhine, their settlements perched on hills above the muddy flow. There were others too, smaller groups whose names have been lost, absorbed into the larger tribal confederations or scattered by war and migration. What united them was their relationship with the river and with Rome. The Rhine was both highway and boundary, a silver ribbon of commerce and conflict. On the western bank, Roman civilization, or what remained of it. Villas with mosaic floors, towns with amphitheatres and bathhouses, roads paved with stone stretching away to the south and west, carrying the trade of the Mediterranean world. On the eastern bank, the forests of Germania, dark woods where wolves still hunted, clearings with long houses clustered around central hearths, fields carved from the wilderness by axe and fire. The Franks lived between these worlds. They traded with Rome, serving sometimes as mercenaries in the legions, learning Latin words and Roman ways. But they remained themselves. They kept their language, their customs, their gods. They wore their hair long, a mark of their free status. A Frank who cut his hair short declared himself a slave. Free men let their hair flow to their shoulders and beyond, a visible statement of their liberty and their connection to the sacred powers that ruled their world. Their gods were the gods of the north. Wotan, called by the Romans Mercury, Donar, the thunderer, whom the Romans knew as Jupiter. Freya, the goddess of love and fertility. These deities demanded sacrifice, offerings of animals and ale poured out on the earth. The Franks buried their dead with weapons and grave goods, preparing them for a journey to the afterlife. They believed in fate, in weird, the inexorable weaving of destiny that no man could escape. Courage was the highest virtue. A man who died in battle went to feast with the gods. A man who died in his bed, of age or sickness, went to a darker place. They were farmers and warriors both, as most Germanic peoples were. The rhythm of the year was the rhythm of ploughing and planting, of harvest and slaughter. But when spring came and the rivers could be crossed, when summer made the roads passable, then it was time for war. The young men would gather, bright with anticipation, their spears newly sharpened, their shields painted with bold designs, They would follow their chiefs on raids across the Rhine, striking at Roman towns and villas, seizing cattle and slaves and precious metals, then fading back into the forests before the legions could respond. Rome tried to contain them. Treaties were signed, promising peace in exchange for land or money. Foederati agreements were made, binding Frankish chiefs to serve Rome in exchange for settlement rights on Roman soil. Some Franks rose high in Roman service, commanding legions, governing provinces, wearing the toga and speaking elegant Latin. But the frontier remained unstable, a place where cultures mixed and clashed, where the old order was slowly, almost imperceptibly, giving way to something new. In the year 406, everything changed. The Rhine froze solid that winter, frozen so thoroughly that entire armies could cross on the ice. And cross they did. Vandals, Alans, Suevers, a great migration of peoples fleeing pressure from the east, fleeing the Huns who had erupted out of the steppes like a storm of fire and iron. The frozen river became a highway of invasion. The carefully maintained frontier shattered, and in the chaos that followed, the Franks saw their opportunity. The dying light of Rome. The 5th century was an age of endings. The world that Rome had built, that vast, interconnected system of trade and law and military might, was coming apart. Not all at once, not with a single catastrophic blow, but slowly, province by province, legion by legion, the structure was failing. In Britannia, the legions had been withdrawn. The Romano-British population was left to fend for itself against Saxon pirates and raiders from across the North Sea. In Hispania, the Visigoths were carving out their own kingdom, nominally allied to Rome but increasingly independent. In Africa, the Vandals had crossed from Spain and seized the richest provinces, cutting off the grain supply that fed the city of Rome itself. And in Gaul, the great province that had once been the jewel of the Western Empire, authority was fracturing into a patchwork of competing powers. The Roman administrative system still functioned, after a fashion. Governors still held court in the provincial capitals. Bishops, increasingly, took on civil responsibilities as the secular government weakened. Landowners fortified their villas and raised private armies. In some regions, local strongmen declared themselves kings or emperors, ruling over territories no larger than a few days' march. The empire had not fallen, not yet, but it was hollow, its strength sapped, its unity broken. This was the world into which Childeric was born, probably in the year 430 or thereabouts. His father, Merovech, was a Frankish king of the Salian branch, ruling over territories in what is now northern France and Belgium. Merovech himself is a shadowy figure, known to us mainly through later legend. Some sources claim he fought alongside the Romans against Attila the Hun at the Great Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 and 4, where the tide of Hunnic invasion was finally turned back. Other sources say he was half fish, born of a sea monster, a fantastical origin story that later generations would use to explain the dynasty's name. Merovingian, the descendants of Merovech. Whether Merovech was man or myth, or some combination of both, his son Childeric was real enough. The tomb at Tournai proves that, and the chronicles, fragmentary as they are, tell us something of what he accomplished. He inherited a position of some power, but not supreme authority. The Salian Franks were still one tribe among many, still nominally subject to Roman overlordship, still operating within the framework of imperial politics. Even as that framework crumbled, Childeric made himself useful to Rome. He allied with Aegidius, the last Roman general in northern Gaul, a man who held back the barbarian tide through force of personality and military skill long after any real support from the imperial government had ceased. Together, they fought against the Visigoths pushing up from the south. They fought against the Saxons raiding along the coast. They fought against other Frankish tribes who saw Childeric as a rival or a traitor to Germanic solidarity. The world Childeric inhabited was one of shifting loyalties and temporary alliances. A man might fight for Rome one year and against Rome the next. He might call himself a subject of the emperor while acting entirely independently. Titles mattered less than actual power. Treaties were made to be broken when circumstances changed. Survival required flexibility, cunning, and the ability to read which way the wind was blowing, and the wind was blowing toward a new order, an order in which Germanic kings would rule where Roman emperors had once held sway, an order in which the language of power would shift from Latin to the various Germanic tongues, an order in which the structures of tribal society, the personal bonds between lord and warrior, would replace the impersonal bureaucracy of Rome. But that order would also preserve much of what Rome had built. The Church, growing in strength and influence, would maintain Latin as the language of learning and religion. Roman law would blend with Germanic custom. The cities, much reduced, would endure. Childeric died in 481. He was buried with his treasure, his bees, his sword. He had expanded Frankish territory. He had established his family as the dominant power among the Salian Franks. He had navigated the treacherous waters of late Roman politics and emerged stronger, but he had not united the Frankish tribes. He had not conquered Gaul. He had not founded a kingdom that would endure for centuries. Those achievements would fall to his son, to Clovis, Childeric, first of his name. The archaeological evidence tells us that Childeric was a man of considerable wealth and status. The treasure from his tomb, even accounting for what was lost over the centuries, and what was stolen when thieves broke into the Louvre in 1831 and made off with many of the artifacts, speaks of resources far beyond those of an ordinary tribal chieftain. The sword alone, with its gold fittings and garnet inlays, would have required skilled craftsmen and expensive materials. The golden bees, 300 of them, represent an astonishing investment of precious metal. This was a man who commanded loyalty, who could demand tribute, who participated in the wider networks of power and wealth that still connected the late Roman world. But who was he beyond the gold and garnets? What manner of man was Childeric of the Franks? The written sources are frustratingly sparse. Gregory of Tours, writing a century after Childeric's death, had access to sources now lost to us, but even Gregory's account is brief. He tells us that Childeric was exiled for a time because of his excessive pursuit of the wives and daughters of the Franks, that he fled to Thuringia, that a faithful friend kept his position open for him by dividing a golden coin and promising that Childeric could return when his half of the coin was sent to him. It is the stuff of legend more than history, the kind of tale that gets attached to distant figures, explaining through story what cannot be known through documentary evidence. What we can say with more certainty is that Childeric operated in the world of late Roman Gaul with considerable skill. He allied with Aegidius, as mentioned, and after Aegidius's death in 464 or thereabouts, Childeric continued to hold his position against multiple rivals. He fought against the Saxon leader Odoacer, not the famous Odoacer, who would later depose the last Western Roman emperor, but another man of the same name, a reflection of how common these stories of barbarian ambition had become. He campaigned against the Visigoths. He defended his territories against other Frankish chiefs who saw his alliance with Rome as a betrayal of Germanic independence. The grave goods suggest something of his cultural position. He was buried with Roman coins, evidence of his connection to imperial systems of trade and tribute. He was buried with a throwing axe, a francisca, the characteristic weapon of the Franks, which gave the tribe its name according to some sources. He was buried with those mysterious bees, which may have been decorative elements from his clothing or regalia, symbols whose precise meaning is now lost, but which clearly held significance. The mixture is revealing. Childeric was Roman enough to use imperial coinage, Germanic enough to be buried with traditional weapons, and unique enough to have his own symbolic vocabulary. He was also Christian, or at least he was buried in Christian fashion. The tomb was oriented east to west, following Christian practice. There was a church on the site, though we cannot be certain whether it existed in Childeric's time or was built later. Some scholars argue that Childeric converted to Christianity late in life. Others suggest he may have been Christian all along, or at least nominally Christian, adopting the religion of Rome while his followers remained largely pagan. The evidence is ambiguous, as so much evidence from this period is. What seems clear is that Childeric walked a careful line between worlds. He presented himself as a Roman official, holding the title of Magister Militum, master of soldiers, a high Roman military rank, but he ruled as a Germanic king, surrounded by his warrior companions, his comitatus, bound to him by oaths of personal loyalty. He participated in Roman political networks, marrying into Romanized families, sending embassies, observing diplomatic niceties, but he remained fundamentally Frankish, his power based on his ability to lead warriors in battle, to distribute plunder, to demonstrate the courage and cunning that Germanic society valued above all else. When Childeric died in 481, he left his kingdom to his son Clovis, a boy of perhaps 15 years. It was a precarious inheritance. The Franks were divided into multiple tribes, each with their own kings. Roman authority in Gaul was represented by Syagrius, the son of Aegidius, who ruled from Soissons and maintained the fiction of imperial continuity, even though no emperor in either Rome or Constantinople would have recognized his authority. The Visigoths controlled the south and west. The Burgundians held the Rhone valley. The Alemanni pressed from across the Rhine. And everywhere, the old Roman administrative system was giving way to local strongmen and competing warlords. The world into which Clovis stepped was one of opportunity and danger in equal measure. The framework of Roman power was broken. Any man strong enough and clever enough might seize control of the pieces and forge them into something new. But the competition was fierce, and failure meant death, exile, or absorption into someone else's growing power. Clovis was young, untested, and ruling over a portion of the Frankish people, not all of them. He would need to move quickly, strike decisively, and prove himself worthy of the warriors who had followed his father. He would need to be more than Childeric's son. He would need to become Clovis, king of all the Franks, and one day, founder of a dynasty. You walk through morning mist. You wake before dawn in a world still half dreaming. The air is cold and wet, heavy with moisture that clings to your skin and soaks through your woolen tunic. All around you, the settlement is stirring. You hear the creak of leather hinges as doors open in the long houses. You hear the soft murmur of voices, men and women speaking in the fluid consonants of Frankish, a language that flows like water over stones. You hear a baby crying, quickly hushed. Dogs bark in the distance. Somewhere, a rooster crows, announcing the coming day. You rise from your sleeping bench, your body stiff from the cold. The fire in the central hearth has burned down to embers during the night, and you feed it carefully, adding small sticks first, then larger pieces of wood as the flames catch and grow. The smoke rises, curling up toward the hole in the roof, and the familiar smell of burning oak fills the hall. It is a good smell, a safe smell, the smell of home and warmth and the barrier between you and the wild darkness outside. You step outside into the mist. It hangs over everything, a grey blanket that turns the world ghostly and strange. You can see the outline of the palisade wall that surrounds the settlement, but beyond that, nothing. The forest might as well not exist. The river, which you know is there, only a few hundred paces distant, makes no sound. The world has shrunk to what you can touch, what you can hear, what you can smell. You walk toward the well, your feet finding the familiar path even in the limited visibility. The grass is wet with dew, soaking your leather shoes. You can smell the earth, rich and dark, mingling with the scent of wood smoke and cooking fires now beginning to be lit throughout the settlement. Somewhere, you catch the sharp tang of horse manure from the enclosure where the warriors' mounts are kept. The chief has perhaps 20 horses, a sign of his wealth and status. Most people walk everywhere they go. The well is simply a depression in the ground, lined with stones and planks to keep it from collapsing. You lower the bucket, hearing the splash as it hits the water far below, and then haul it back up, hand over hand, the rope rough against your palms. The water is cold and clear. You drink deeply, then splash some on your face, gasping at the shock of it. Around you, the settlement continues to wake. Women emerge from the long houses, shaking out bedding, calling to children. You hear the rhythmic sound of someone grinding grain, stone against stone, preparing flour for bread. You hear the ring of metal on metal from the smithy, where the smith is already at work, his forge glowing red in the dimness. The smell of cooking reaches you, porridge perhaps, or bread baking in the ashes. You are aware of the rhythms of this life in your bones, the morning work of tending animals, drawing water, starting fires, the midday work of the fields or the workshop or the household, the evening gathering when warriors return from patrol or hunting, when news is shared, when the community comes together in the great hall, the night, when stories are told by firelight, when the scop sings the old songs, when the world beyond the palisade becomes a place of darkness and uncertain things. This is the life Chalderic would have known, though as a king, his experience of it was different from yours. He would have sat at the high seat in the hall. He would have worn rings of gold on his arms and a sword with a jewelled hilt at his side. But the rhythms would have been the same dawn mist, the same smell of smoke and cooking, the same sounds of a settlement waking to face another day in a world that is always uncertain, always balanced between survival and catastrophe. The mist begins to lift as the sun rises higher. The world reveals itself gradually, like a secret being shared. First, the nearest buildings, then the palisade, then the fields beyond, stretching away toward the forest edge, then the forest itself, dark and deep, the source of timber and game and danger. And finally, if you look toward the west, you might see the road, the old Roman road that leads south toward what remains of civilization, towards stone buildings and written laws and the memory of empire. This is the world between forest and field, between tribe and kingdom, between the old gods and the new god the Romans worship, between the familiar past and an uncertain future. You finish your water, set down the bucket, and turn back toward the long house. There is work to be done. There is always work to be done. The day has begun. The boy who would be king, Clovis, was 15 years old when his father died, perhaps 16. The sources disagree on his exact age, as they disagree on so many details from this distant time. But he was young, certainly too young by modern standards, to inherit a kingdom, to command warriors, to navigate the treacherous currents of late 5th century politics. Yet inherit he did, because the Franks had no concept of minority, no regency system to protect young kings until they came of age. A king was a king from the moment of succession, or he was nothing. The name Clovis is itself instructive. In the Latin sources, he is Clodovicus or Ludovicus, from which both Louis and Ludwig derive. In his own tongue, he would have been Clodovech, a name that means approximately famous in battle or renowned warrior. Names mattered to the Franks. They were declarations of intent, statements of identity, sometimes prophecies. To be named famous in battle suggested that battle fame was expected, demanded, assumed. The boy king faced immediate challenges. The Salian Franks whom he ruled were only one portion of the Frankish people. Other kings ruled other tribes. Ragnachar held Cambrai. Chararic ruled in an unknown location, perhaps in the marshlands of what is now northern Belgium. These were men of Clovis's own people, potential allies or rivals, depending on how the political winds blew. Then there were the external powers, Syagrius in Soissons, calling himself King of the Romans, though no emperor in Constantinople would have recognized the title. The Alemanni across the Rhine, always pressing westward. The Burgundians to the south, a powerful kingdom with its own ambitions. The Visigoths in the southwest, the strongest Germanic kingdom in Gaul, nominally allied to the Eastern Emperor, but pursuing their own interests. Clovis had inherited his father's treasure, which mattered. Gold bought loyalty, gold equipped warriors. Gold could be given as gifts to secure alliances, or as bribes to neutralize enemies. He had inherited his father's war band, the core group of warriors personally bound to the Merovingian house. These were men who had fought alongside Childeric, who had shared in his victories and his plunder, who had sworn oaths that transferred to his son. Their loyalty was not automatic, but it was presumed, at least initially. What Clovis did not inherit was a unified kingdom or a secure position. He had to prove himself. Germanic kingship was not purely hereditary. Yes, the king had to come from the royal family. Yes, blood mattered. But so did capability. A weak king could be set aside, formally or through the simple mechanism of warriors choosing to follow someone else. A young king had to demonstrate quickly that he was worthy of the title his birth had given him. The early years of Clovis's reign are obscure. Gregory of Tours, our primary source, was writing a century later and had limited information. He tells us that Clovis and his kinsman Ragnachar fought together against Syagrius, defeating him at the Battle of Soissons in the year 486, just 5 years after Childric's death. Whether there were other campaigns in those 5 years, other tests and challenges that Clovis faced and overcame, we simply do not know. What we can say is that by 486, Clovis had consolidated his position enough to undertake a major military expedition. He had held his kingdom together. He had kept the loyalty of his warband. He had convinced or coerced Ragnachar to join him in a campaign against the last remnant of Roman authority in northern Gaul. That was no small achievement for a young man barely out of adolescence. Imagine him in those early years, still growing into his full strength, learning the arts of war and politics, listening to the advice of older warriors who had served his father, perhaps making mistakes, as young rulers often do, but learning from them, growing harder and more cunning with each challenge faced and overcome. He would have led hunting parties, learning to track game through the forests, learning the patience required to wait for the perfect moment to strike. He would have presided over assemblies of the Frankish warriors, learning to read men's faces, to judge when to speak and when to listen, to balance firmness with flexibility. He would have begun to build his own reputation, separate from his father's. Perhaps he was generous with plunder, a quality warriors valued highly. Perhaps he was brave in battle, fighting in the front ranks rather than directing from behind. Perhaps he showed signs of the ruthless calculation that would mark his later career, the willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. We cannot know the details, but we know the result. Within 5 years of his accession, Clovis was ready to challenge Syagrius, to strike at the heart of Roman power in Gaul, to begin the expansion that would transform the Franks from one tribe among many into the dominant power in Western Europe. The boy who inherited a precarious throne in 481 was becoming the man who would unite the Franks, conquer Gaul, and lay the foundations for a dynasty that would rule for nearly 3 centuries. But first, there would be battles, blood and iron, decisions that would haunt the guilty and glorify the bold, and a lesson about a vase that would reveal the kind of king Clovis was becoming, Soissons and the vase. The campaign against Syagrius was brief and decisive. 2 Frankish armies, one led by Clovis and one by his kinsman Ragnachar, converged on Soissons. Syagrius, outnumbered and outmaneuvered, gave battle and was defeated. The sources do not describe the battle itself. We do not know if it was a close-run thing or a rout. We do not know how many men died in the fields outside Soissons, their blood soaking into the Gallic soil. What we know is that Syagrius fled south to the Visigothic kingdom, seeking refuge with King Alaric II. The Visigoths handed him over. Whether this was a calculated political decision, a recognition that Clovis was now too powerful to antagonize, or simply adherence to the custom that kings did not shelter each other's defeated enemies, we cannot say. Syagrius was returned to Clovis and executed. The last representative of Roman authority in northern Gaul died by Frankish hands, and the kingdom of Soissons, that strange remnant of imperial power, ceased to exist. Clovis was now master of territories, stretching from the Somme to the Loire. But before that final settlement, before the division of spoils and the consolidation of conquest, there was the matter of the vase. The Franks had sacked Soissons thoroughly. Churches, villas, public buildings, all were stripped of anything valuable. Among the plunder taken from one church was a vase of exceptional beauty and size. Gregory of Tours describes it as being of wondrous size and beauty, suggesting something substantial, perhaps made of silver or adorned with precious metals. The bishop of that church sent messengers to Clovis, asking that if the king could not return all the sacred vessels that had been taken, might he at least return this one particular vase? Clovis agreed. He told the messengers to come to the division of spoils at Soissons, and he would see what could be done. The Frankish custom for dividing plunder was egalitarian in a way that would have seemed strange to Romans. All the spoils were gathered in one place. Then each warrior drew lots for his share, or in some versions, the warriors simply took turns selecting items from the pile. A king had no special right to choose first, or to claim more than his share. He was first among equals, primus, inter pares. And while his voice carried weight in council and his leadership in battle gave him prestige, when it came to the division of wealth, he was simply another warrior. Clovis addressed his men. He pointed to the vase and said that in addition to his regular share, he would like to have this particular piece. Most of the warriors agreed willingly. Why not? There was plenty of other plunder, and the king had led them to victory. If he wanted one specific item, what was the harm? But one warrior, described as impulsive and envious, struck the vase with his battle axe, saying, "You shall receive nothing of this unless a just lot gives it to you." The vase was damaged but not destroyed. Clovis said nothing. He took the vase, such as it was, and returned it to the bishop's messengers. The assembly broke up. The plunder was divided. The Frankish army dispersed to their homes, richer in gold and cattle and slaves than they had been before. A year passed. Spring came again, and with it, the season for military review. Clovis assembled his warriors, inspecting their weapons and equipment, ensuring they were ready for the campaigning season. He came to the man who had struck the vase. He examined the warriors' weapons and found fault with them. The axe was poorly maintained. The spear point was dull. The shield was in disrepair. Clovis seized the man's weapons and threw them on the ground in disgust. As the warrior bent to retrieve them, Clovis drew his own axe and split the man's skull, saying, "Thus did you do to the vase at Soissons." The man fell dead. Clovis ordered his removal and continued the inspection as though nothing had happened. And fear, Gregory tells us, fell upon all the Franks who witnessed this act. What are we to make of this story? On one level, it is a tale of royal authority asserting itself. Clovis could not punish the warrior immediately without appearing weak or vindictive. The warrior had acted within his rights according to Frankish custom, but Clovis was building something larger than tribal custom. He was building a kingdom, and in a kingdom, the king's will matters. The king is not simply first among equals. The king is the law. By waiting a year, by finding a legitimate pretext, Clovis punished the offence while maintaining the forms of legitimacy. The message was clear: defy the king, and eventually, justice will find you. On another level, the story reveals something of Clovis's character. He was patient. He did not act on impulse. He could wait for the right moment to settle accounts. He understood the value of ceremony and symbolism. The public execution during the military review was a lesson to all who watched. This is what happens to those who mock the king. This is the price of insubordination. Fear me. But there is also a religious dimension. Clovis returned the vase to the church. He honoured, or appeared to honour, the bishop's request. This was still early in his reign, before his conversion to Christianity. Yet he was already sensitive to the power of the church, already cultivating relationships with bishops who controlled not just spiritual authority, but also influence over the Romanized population of Gaul. The church was useful. The church could legitimize. The church could provide the administrative infrastructure that Germanic tribal structures lacked. The vase became a symbol, not the object itself, which was damaged and then given away, but the story. It circulated among the Franks. It was told and retold. It became part of the legend of Clovis, evidence of his justice and his authority, and perhaps that was the point all along. Perhaps Clovis, even at 20 years old, understood the power of stories, the way a single dramatic act could shape how people perceived their king. The boy who had inherited a precarious throne was becoming a man who understood power in all its dimensions: military, political, symbolic, and religious. The next great test was approaching, and this time it would not be about treasure or territory, it would be about faith itself. The long hair. There is something you must understand about the Merovingians, something fundamental to who they were and how they saw themselves. Their hair was sacred, not in the casual sense that modern people might use the word, not simply important or meaningful, truly sacred. set apart, imbued with spiritual power. The long hair of a Merovingian king was the visible sign of his right to rule, the physical manifestation of his connection to the divine forces that governed the world. To cut that hair was to sever that connection, to reduce a king to an ordinary man, to remove him from power as surely as if you had taken his sword and his throne. This was an ancient belief, reaching back into the Germanic past, perhaps even further into the mists of Indo-European tradition. The hair was where strength resided. Think of Samson in the Hebrew scriptures, his power bound up in his uncut locks. Think of the Celtic warriors described by classical authors, their hair limed and styled into elaborate crests. There was a widespread understanding that hair, especially long hair worn by men, carried significance beyond the merely aesthetic. For the Franks, and particularly for the Merovingian royal house, this took on special meaning. Only those of royal blood could wear their hair long and flowing. Other men might have beards, might let their hair grow to some extent, but the distinctive long locks that fell past the shoulders, sometimes nearly to the waist, were reserved for the king and his sons. To see a man with such hair was to know immediately that you stood in the presence of royalty. The ritual tonsure, the cutting of hair, became a way to dispose of political rivals without actually killing them. If you wanted to remove a potential claimant to the throne, you did not need to risk the blood guilt of regicide. You simply cut his hair. He remained alive, but he was no longer a viable candidate for kingship. He had been reduced, made common, stripped of the sacred quality that set kings apart. Some men so treated entered monasteries, their enforced tonsure becoming a kind of religious vocation. Others simply disappeared from history, reduced to obscurity by the removal of their crown's chief symbol. This would become particularly important in the bitter, dynastic struggles of later Merovingian history. Queens would have their rivals' children tonsured, ending their political futures while preserving a veneer of mercy. Brothers would threaten each other, with shears as readily as with swords. The hair became both symbol and vulnerability, a source of power and a target for those seeking to destroy that power. But in Clovis's time, the hair was still primarily a mark of legitimacy and connection to tradition. When Clovis stood before his warriors, his hair flowing free, he was not simply displaying vanity, he was demonstrating his fitness to rule. He was showing that he carried the sacred quality inherited from his father and his father's father back through the generations to Merovech himself, whether Merovech was man or myth or something in between. Picture a Merovingian king in his prime. The hair, yes, perhaps golden or auburn, the shades common among the Germanic peoples, but also the bearing, the carriage, the awareness of sacred status. He would have worn that hair carefully, perhaps with ornaments woven into it, gold wire or beads of amber. He would have had servants attend to it, combing out tangles, washing it with care, perfuming it with herbs. It was armour of a sort, spiritual armour, and it required maintenance just as a sword required sharpening and a shield required repair. The long hair would persist throughout the Merovingian dynasty, even as other aspects of Frankish culture changed or disappeared. As the Franks became Christian, as they adopted Roman administrative practices, as their language shifted and their customs evolved, the hair remained. It became a distinguishing feature, the thing that set the Merovingian kings apart from other rulers. The Lombards had their own customs, the Visigoths had their own traditions, but the Franks had the long-haired kings, the reges chroniti, and that image would endure long after the dynasty itself had fallen. When we imagine Clovis, then we should see not the barbarian chieftain of popular imagination, hair wild and unkempt, but a man intensely conscious of his appearance and its meaning, a man who understood that kingship was as much about symbol as about reality, a man whose very hair declared his right to rule and his connection to powers beyond the merely human. The long hair was not an affectation. It was not a fashion statement. It was who the Merovingians were, the visible sign of their sacred kingship, and it would remain so until the very end. Clotilda's faith. The Burgundian kingdom lay to the south and east of Frankish territory, centred on the valley of the Rhône and the city of Lyon. It was smaller than the Visigothic kingdom, but still formidable, a power that could not be ignored in the complex politics of late 5th century Gaul. The Burgundians were themselves Germanic, related to the Franks, but distinct in custom and history. And they were Christian, followers of the Arian form of the faith that most Germanic peoples had adopted. Arianism, named for the presbyter Arius of Alexandria, held that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, created by the Father rather than co-eternal with him. This was the dominant form of Christianity among the Germanic kingdoms. The Visigoths were Arian, the Burgundians were Arian, the Vandals in Africa were Arian, the Ostrogoths in Italy, when they arrived, would be Arian. It created a curious division in the post-Roman world. The Germanic conquerors followed one form of Christianity. The Romanized populations they ruled, along with the bishops and the institutional church, followed the Nicene form, which held that Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were co-equal and co-eternal. This matters for our story because of a Burgundian princess named Clotilde. She was the daughter of King Chilperic of Burgundy, but her father had been murdered by his brother Gundobad in a dynastic struggle typical of the period. Gundobad now ruled the Burgundian kingdom. Clotilde lived at his court, but her position was precarious. She was a reminder of the old king, a potential focus for opposition to Gundobad's rule, and she was, unusually, a Nicene Christian rather than an Arian. How this came about we do not know. Perhaps her mother had been Nicene, perhaps she had been influenced by a Romanized tutor. But in a court of Arian Christians, she held to the form of the faith, followed by the bishops and the old Roman population. Clovis sent envoys to Gundobad seeking a marriage alliance. The political logic was sound. A marriage to the Burgundian royal house would secure Clovis's southern frontier, create obligations of kinship that might prevent conflict, and perhaps open opportunities for future territorial expansion. Gundobad agreed. Perhaps he was happy to be rid of a potential problem. Perhaps he saw advantage in allying with the rising Frankish power. Clotilde was sent north to marry Clovis. Gregory of Tours, our source for this, portrays Clotilde as a devout woman of faith who saw her marriage as an opportunity to bring her husband to the true religion. Whether this is historical reality or pious invention, we cannot know with certainty. Gregory was a bishop, writing to glorify the Catholic faith and the Frankish kingdom that had embraced it. He had every reason to emphasize Clotilde's role in Clovis's eventual conversion. But the basic facts seem solid enough. Clotilde was Christian. Clovis was not, or at least he had not yet formally embraced Christianity. And the marriage brought together not just two people but two religious worlds. The Franks at this time were still largely pagan. They worshipped the old gods. They poured out offerings to Wotan and Donar. They believed in spirits of grove and stream. They practiced augury and consulted omens. Clovis himself, as king, had special responsibilities to maintain the relationship between his people and the sacred powers. His very hair, as we have seen, was a sign of that sacred status. For him to abandon the gods his ancestors had worshipped, to embrace the God of the Christians, would be no small thing. Yet Christianity offered advantages. It was the religion of the Romanized population, the people who still controlled much of the administrative machinery of Gaul, the bishops who wielded enormous influence. It was the religion of Constantinople, the Eastern Empire that still held prestige and power. It was a religion with universal claims, a God who promised victory to those who believed, a faith that could unite disparate peoples under a common banner in a way that tribal paganism never could. Clotilde bore Clovis a son. She wanted the child baptized. Clovis was reluctant, but he consented. The baby was baptized, and shortly thereafter, he died. Clovis reproached Clotilde, saying that if the child had been consecrated in the name of his gods, he would have lived, but because he was baptized in the name of her god, he could not survive. Clotilde replied that she was grateful to Almighty God that her child had been deemed worthy to join the kingdom of heaven. She bore another son. He too was baptized, and he too fell ill. Clovis said this one would die just as his brother had. But Clotilde prayed, and the child recovered. Still, Clovis did not convert. He continued to sacrifice to the old gods. He continued to rule as a pagan king, over a largely pagan people, the tension must have been considerable. A Christian wife urging one path, traditional warriors and advisors urging another, the weight of ancestral custom pulling one way, the promise of Roman legitimacy and ecclesiastical support pulling another. Clovis stood at the centre of this tension, feeling the pull from both sides, calculating advantages, weighing risks. He was in his late 20s now, experienced in war and politics, secure on his throne. But the greatest decision of his life was approaching, and it would be made, as so many crucial decisions are, not in calm deliberation but in the heat and terror of battle, the battle in the storm. The Alemanni came from across the Rhine, a Germanic confederation that had long pressed against the Roman frontier, and now saw opportunity in the chaos of post-imperial Gaul. They were fierce warriors, pagan like the Franks, worshipping the same gods, following the same customs. They had expanded westward, threatening territories that Clovis now claimed. And so in the year 496, somewhere near the town of Tolbiac, the Franks and the Alemanni met in battle. The sources do not give us details of tactics or troop numbers. What Gregory of Tours tells us is that the fighting was fierce and that Clovis's army was being cut to pieces. The Franks were losing, warriors were falling, the battle line was breaking, defeat loomed, and with it death or flight or subjugation. Everything Clovis had built in 15 years of rule was on the verge of collapsing in a single afternoon of blood and iron. Clovis had prayed to his gods. He had invoked Wotan, lord of battle. He had called on Donar the thunderer, but the gods of his fathers were silent. The battle turned against him. The Alemanni pressed forward. Frankish warriors were dying by the dozen, by the score. The end was approaching. And in that moment of extremity, Clovis did something extraordinary. He lifted his eyes to heaven, and he spoke to the God of Clotilde, the God of the Christians, Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde claimed to be the Son of the living God. Gregory gives us the prayer. Whether accurately transcribed or composed for literary effect, we cannot know. Jesus Christ, whom Clotilde proclaims to be the Son of the living God, who art said to give aid to those in trouble, and to grant victory to those who hope in thee, I beseech the glory of thy aid. If thou shalt grant me victory over these enemies, and I experience that power which people consecrated in thy name say they have experienced concerning thee, I will believe in thee, and be baptized in thy name. For I have called upon my own gods, but as I have proved, they are far removed from helping me. I therefore believe that they are endowed with no power, for they do not succour those who serve them. I now call upon thee. I desire to believe in thee. Only deliver me from my adversaries. It was a conditional vow, a bargain struck in desperation. If the Christian God would grant victory, Clovis would convert. If not, well, nothing lost beyond hope already fading. But the psychology of it is fascinating. Clovis was a man who calculated odds, who weighed advantages, who made decisions based on expected outcomes. Here, facing annihilation, he was making a different kind of calculation. He was betting everything on a God he did not yet believe in, based on the testimony of his wife and the promises of the Christian faith. And the battle turned, whether through divine intervention or simple chance, whether because the Alemanni had overextended themselves, or because the Franks found renewed courage in their king's desperate prayer, the tide shifted. The king of the Alemanni fell, struck down in the fighting. With their leader dead, Alemannic resistance collapsed. They threw down their weapons and submitted, saying, "We beseech thee, do not let more of the people perish. We are now thine." Clovis stopped the slaughter. He accepted the Alemannic surrender. The battle was won. The Franks had triumphed. And Clovis had made a vow that he could not break without dishonour. He returned to his kingdom and told Clotilde what he had promised. She was overjoyed. She sent for Saint Remigius, the Bishop of Reims, a man of great learning and influence, and asked him to instruct Clovis in the Christian faith. Remigius came and spoke to the king, teaching him about the creation of the world, about the fall of man, about the incarnation and resurrection of Christ. But Clovis was not yet ready to commit. "I have listened to you willingly, most Holy Father," he said, "but one thing remains. The people who follow me will not endure the abandonment of their gods, but I will go and speak to them, according to your word." It was a reasonable concern. A king who converted while his warriors remained pagan risked losing their loyalty. The gods were not abstractions to the Franks. They were living powers who granted victory and prosperity. To abandon them was to risk their anger and punishment. Clovis needed his warriors to convert with him, or at least to accept his conversion without rebellion. But when Clovis assembled his warriors and began to speak, before he could make his case, they cried out, "We reject the mortal gods, pious king, and we are prepared to follow the immortal God whom Remigius preaches." Whether this was spontaneous or orchestrated, whether the warriors had been prepared in advance, or were genuinely moved by the moment, we cannot know. What matters is that the obstacle was removed. The warriors consented. The gods of the ancestors could be abandoned without dishonor, because the people themselves chose to abandon them. Clovis was free to fulfill his vow. The baptism was set for Christmas Day in the year 508, though some scholars argue for 506 or even earlier. The exact date matters less than what happened. Bishop Remigius prepared the baptistry in the cathedral at Reims. The streets of the city were hung with coloured cloths and tapestries. Churches were adorned with white hangings. The baptistry was prepared. Incense burned. Candles gleamed like stars. The entire city, Gregory tells us, was filled with divine fragrance and heavenly light. Clovis came to the baptistry, ready to wash away his former life. Remigius spoke the famous words that Gregory records, words that would echo down through French history. "Meekly bow your head, Sicamber. Worship what you have burned. Burn what you have worshipped." The Sicambri were an ancient Germanic tribe, ancestors perhaps of the Franks. The name was used to evoke the pagan past that Clovis was leaving behind. He descended into the water. He was baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. He rose from the water, a Christian, a Catholic Christian, follower of the Nicene Creed that the bishops proclaimed and the emperor in Constantinople endorsed. More than 3,000 of his warriors were baptized with him. Whether they understood the theology or simply followed their king, we cannot say. But the effect was profound. The Franks became the only major Germanic kingdom to follow Nicene Christianity rather than Arianism. They became, in effect, the secular arm of the Catholic Church in the West. They became the chosen people in the minds of later generations, the new Israel, the warrior race that would defend the faith against heretics and pagans. Everything that followed, the expansion of Frankish power, the alliance with the papacy, the foundation of medieval Christendom, all of it traced back to this moment, to the battle at Tolbiac, to the desperate prayer in the storm of combat, to the vow made and kept, to the water of baptism closing over the head of a barbarian king, washing away the old world and birthing something new. Baptism at Reims, the water that closed over Clovis's head on that Christmas day in 508, carried more than symbolic weight. It carried political implications that would reshape the map of Western Europe. In one ritual act, performed in the cathedral at Reims, before witnesses both Frankish and Gallo-Roman, before warriors and bishops and common people gathered to watch their king reborn, Clovis had solved a problem that bedeviled every other Germanic kingdom of his time. The Visigoths in Spain and southern Gaul were Arian Christians ruling over a Nicene Christian population. The religious divide created constant tension, a fault line running through their kingdom that limited their ability to integrate with the Roman populations they governed. The Burgundians faced the same problem. The Vandals in Africa, the Ostrogoths in Italy when they arrived, all of them were Arian rulers over Nicene subjects. The Germanic conquerors and the conquered Romans worshipped the same god, but understood him differently, and that difference mattered. Clovis, by embracing Nicene Christianity, by submitting to baptism at the hands of a Gallo-Roman bishop, by bringing his warriors with him into the church, had eliminated that divide. The Franks and the Gallo-Romans now shared the same faith. They could intermarry without religious scruple. They could cooperate without the suspicion that always attends dealings between heretic and orthodox. The bishops, who controlled much of the administrative apparatus that had survived Rome's collapse, who influenced the Gallo-Roman aristocracy, who spoke for the urban populations, could support Clovis without compromising their theological principles. Bishop Remigius understood what had happened. The baptism was not just a personal conversion. It was a political revolution wrapped in religious ceremony. In the letters Remigius wrote after the baptism, his language reveals his awareness of the moment's significance. He addressed Clovis with respect, but also with expectation. The king had joined the church. Now the church had expectations of him. He should govern justly. He should protect bishops and their flocks. He should extend the faith to territories not yet Christian. He should be, in effect, the strong right arm of Catholic Christianity in Gaul. The emperor, in Constantinople, Anastasius, sent envoys with gifts and recognition. Clovis was granted the title of consul, a meaningless honour in practical terms, but one that carried enormous prestige. The Eastern Empire, heir to Rome's tradition, acknowledged Clovis as legitimate. He could present himself not as a barbarian usurper, but as a Roman official, rightfully exercising authority granted by the emperor himself. That the emperor was far away and exercised no real power in Gaul mattered less than the symbolism. Clovis could cloak his conquests in the mantle of Roman legitimacy and Christian piety. The baptism transformed Clovis's relationship with the Gallo-Roman aristocracy as well. These were families who traced their lineage back to the days of empire, who still maintained their estates, who spoke refined Latin and read classical literature, who saw themselves as guardians of civilization against the barbarian flood. They had submitted to Frankish rule because they had no choice, but now their conqueror was one of them in faith. He attended the same liturgy, he received the same sacraments, he could marry into their families without creating religious complications for the offspring. The barriers between conqueror and conquered began to erode. This is not to say the process was smooth or immediate. Centuries would pass before Franks and Romans fully merged into a single people. Language differences persisted, with the Franks speaking their Germanic tongue, while the Gallo-Romans spoke the evolving Latin that would become French. Cultural differences remained in law and custom and social organisation, but the baptism at Reims started the process of integration that would eventually produce medieval France. Clovis made other changes as well. He established his primary residence at Paris, a city with Roman roots, strategically located on the Seine. He began to patronise churches, donating land and treasure, building relationships with bishops throughout his realm. He convened church councils, presiding over meetings of clergy, showing himself a defender of orthodoxy and ecclesiastical order. He issued laws that blended Frankish custom with Roman legal principles, creating a framework for governance that both populations could recognise. The warriors who had been baptised with him adapted to the new faith with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Some embraced Christianity fully, becoming patrons of monasteries, founding churches on their estates, raising their children in the new religion. Others maintained a more superficial adherence, attending Mass because the king commanded it, but privately still invoking the old gods in times of crisis. Still others probably resented the conversion, but kept their feelings hidden, knowing that open paganism would now mark them as outsiders in the king's favour. The transition from pagan to Christian kingdom was not instantaneous. Old beliefs persisted in the countryside, in remote villages where no bishop's authority reached, among populations who saw little difference between the Christian God and the spirits their ancestors had worshipped. The church would spend centuries working to root out these remnants of paganism, often by absorbing them, by Christianizing old sacred sites, by turning pagan festivals into saints' days, by gradually transforming the religious landscape through persistence and adaptation. But in the cities, among the aristocracy, in the circles of power where decisions were made and policies set, Christianity was now the only acceptable faith. Clovis had made his choice, and that choice defined the future of the Frankish kingdom. The long-haired king who had prayed to Wotan as a boy now heard Mass celebrated in Latin, now received communion, now endowed churches with the plunder of his conquests. The transformation was complete. The Franks were no longer a pagan tribe raiding across the Rhine. They were a Christian kingdom, heir to Rome's legacy, defender of the faith, and increasingly, master of Gaul. The architecture of power, A kingdom is more than a king and his warriors. It requires structure, systems, mechanisms for making decisions and enforcing them across distance and time. The Franks, like most Germanic peoples, had brought with them a tribal organization based on personal relationships, on oaths and kinship, and face-to-face interaction. This worked well enough for a wandering tribe or a small territory, but Clovis now ruled lands stretching from the Somme to the Loire, from the Rhine to the Atlantic. Tribal custom alone could not govern such an expanse. Fortunately, Clovis inherited more than territory from his conquests. He inherited the remnants of Roman administrative machinery, not the full imperial system, which had grown baroque and unwieldy in its final centuries. But enough survived to provide a framework. Cities still had councils, though their powers were much reduced. Tax registers still existed, though collection was sporadic. Roman law still commanded respect, at least among the Gallo-Roman population. Roads, though poorly maintained, still connected the major centres. The institutional memory of how to govern an extensive territory had not entirely vanished. Clovis, pragmatic as always, used what worked. He appointed counts to govern regions, borrowing the title and some of the functions from Roman practice, but adapting it to Frankish custom. These counts were usually Frankish warriors, men he trusted, members of his warband or related to him by blood or marriage. But they governed according to a mix of Frankish and Roman law, adjudicating disputes, collecting revenues, maintaining order. Some learned to work with the existing Gallo-Roman administrative structures, others replaced them with purely Frankish systems. The result was a patchwork, inconsistent from region to region, but functional enough to keep the kingdom running. The most important legal development of this period was the codification of Salic law, the traditional law of the Salian Franks. This was not Clovis's invention. The law had existed in oral form long before him, but during his reign, or shortly thereafter, it was written down in Latin, creating a fixed reference point for legal disputes. The document that survives is called the Pactus Legis Salicae, the Agreement of the Salic Law, and it provides a fascinating window into Frankish society. Salic law was a system of compensations. If you injured someone, you paid a fine, determined by the nature of the injury and the status of the victim. If you killed someone, you paid wergild, literally man price, a sum that varied depending on whether the victim was a Frank or a Roman, a free man or a slave, male or female. The law was precise in its categories. It specified compensation for stealing horses, for killing hunting dogs, for burning barns, for theft of various kinds. It dealt with inheritance, with marriage customs, with the proper procedures for legal proceedings. What it did not include, notably, was any provision for royal succession through the female line. This provision, or rather this absence of provision, would later be invoked to justify the exclusion of women from the French throne. But in Clovis's time, the significance was different. Salic law was a statement that the Franks had their own legal tradition, their own principles of justice, codified now in writing like Roman law, but distinctly Germanic in character and origin. Clovis maintained relationships with the Eastern Empire as well. Though these were largely symbolic, Constantinople was far away, focused on its wars with Persia and its theological controversies. The emperor could not project military power into Gaul, but the connection mattered for prestige. Clovis received honours and titles. He wore imperial insignia on ceremonial occasions. He maintained the fiction that he governed as an imperial official, even though in practice he answered to no one. The church provided another layer of administration. Bishops had become, in the absence of effective secular government, the real powers in many cities. They controlled property, they mediated disputes, they provided poor relief. They maintained libraries and schools, they corresponded with each other, creating a network of communication that spanned the former empire. Clovis cultivated these bishops carefully. He granted them privileges. He confirmed their landholdings. He presided over church councils, showing himself a defender of orthodoxy. In return, the bishops provided legitimacy, administrative capacity, and influence over the urban populations. The military remained the foundation of Frankish power. Clovis maintained a personal warband, warriors bound to him by oaths and rewarded with land and plunder. But he also called up larger armies when needed, assembling the free men of the Frankish people for major campaigns. These levies were temporary. Men served for a season, then returned to their farms. But while assembled, they formed a formidable force. Experienced warriors who had grown up with weapons, who practiced combat as a matter of course, who considered military service an honour and an obligation. The economy of the Frankish kingdom was primarily agricultural. Most people worked the land, producing grain and livestock, living in small villages, paying rents or tribute to local lords. Trade continued, though at a reduced level compared to Roman times. Wine moved north from the Mediterranean. Amber came south from the Baltic. Salt was extracted from coastal marshes and inland springs. Slaves, taken in war or raid, were a commodity like any other. Coins were still minted, though the gold content gradually declined as bullion became scarcer. Clovis accumulated enormous wealth through conquest. Each defeated enemy yielded plunder. Each annexed territory provided new sources of revenue. The treasure, buried with Childeric, had been impressive. The treasure Clovis, controlled by the end of his reign, was vastly greater. Gold, silver, precious stones, fine fabrics, weapons of exceptional quality, all flowed into the royal coffers. Some was distributed to loyal warriors, maintaining their allegiance through generosity. Some was given to churches, purchasing divine favour and ecclesiastical support. Some was simply hoarded, a reserve against future need, a visible demonstration of royal power. This was the architecture of the Merovingian state, not systematic, not bureaucratic in the modern sense, but effective enough to hold together a diverse territory, to extract resources, to project power, to maintain the king's authority across hundreds of miles. It was a hybrid, blending Germanic tribal tradition with Roman imperial remnants, held together by the personal authority of the king and the allegiance of warriors, who followed him because he led them to victory and rewarded them for their service. As long as the king was strong, the system worked. When the king was weak, as would happen in later generations, the system revealed its fragility. But for now, under Clovis, it was sufficient to the task of ruling the largest and most powerful kingdom in Western Europe. Wealth of the earth. The foundation of any medieval economy was land, and the Frankish kingdom possessed land in abundance. The territories Clovis controlled encompassed some of the richest agricultural regions of Western Europe. The valleys of the Seine, the Loire, the Somme, all produced grain in quantities that could support not just rural populations but urban centres as well. The soil was fertile, well watered by regular rainfall, suitable for wheat and barley and oats. Orchards produced apples and pears. Vineyards, especially in the south, yielded wine that was already gaining a reputation for quality. Livestock was equally important. Cattle provided meat, milk, leather, and muscle power for ploughing. Sheep gave wool for clothing and textile production. Pigs were raised in forests, feeding on acorns and beech nuts, converting woodland resources into meat and fat. Horses were bred both for agriculture and for war, with the finest animals reserved for the warrior aristocracy. The Franks were not yet the heavy cavalry that would later dominate medieval battlefields, but they understood the value of mounted warriors for scouting, raiding, and pursuit. The forests themselves were resources of immense value: timber for construction, both of buildings and ships, fuel for heating and cooking, charcoal for metalworking, game for hunting, including deer, boar, and smaller animals. The forests were managed, after a fashion, with certain areas reserved for royal hunting, others open to common use. To fell a tree without permission in a royal forest was a serious crime, punishable by heavy fines. The forest was not wilderness in the modern sense, but a working landscape, cultivated and exploited like farmland. Trade networks, though diminished from Roman times, still functioned. The Mediterranean remained a highway for commerce, though increasingly dangerous due to piracy and the wars between the Eastern Empire and various powers. Merchants brought luxury goods north, silk from the east, spices, ivory, fine pottery. In return, they took back slaves, furs, amber, and Frankish weapons, which had a reputation for quality. The Frankish Francisca, the throwing axe, was sought after. Frankish swords, pattern-welded, with distinctive wavy designs in the metal, were prized by warriors throughout Europe. The continuation of trade depended on royal protection. Merchants needed safe passage through territories, guarantees that they would not be robbed by bandits or cheated by local officials. Clovis understood this. He issued safe conducts. He punished those who violated them. He recognized that a wealthy kingdom required commerce, that the movement of goods enriched both the merchants who traded them and the king who taxed them. Markets were established in towns, regular gatherings where people from surrounding regions could buy and sell. Fairs, held annually or seasonally, drew merchants from greater distances. Salt was particularly important, essential for preserving meat and fish, for tanning leather, for various industrial processes. Salt was extracted from coastal marshes through evaporation, from inland springs through boiling. The control of salt sources meant wealth and power. Salt routes became major trade corridors. Salt taxes became significant sources of royal revenue. Metalworking was another crucial industry. Iron for tools and weapons, bronze for decorative fittings and luxury items, gold and silver for jewelry, coins, and religious vessels. The Merovingians developed a distinctive style of metalwork, characterized by cloisonné technique, where thin walls of gold or bronze created cells that were then filled with garnets or colored glass. The effect was rich and luminous, catching the light like frozen fire. Merovingian goldsmiths were master craftsmen, their work comparable to anything produced in the Eastern Empire. The church became an economic power in its own right. Monasteries accumulated land through donations from the pious or the guilty, seeking to atone for sins. These monastic estates were often well managed, more productive than secular holdings, because the monks had both the labour and the long-term perspective to invest in improvements. Monasteries produced wine, bred horses, copied manuscripts, and engaged in various crafts. They became centres of economic activity as well as spiritual life. Slavery remained part of the economic system, as it had been in Roman times. Slaves were taken in war, bought from traders, or born into servitude. They worked in households, on estates, in workshops. Their legal status was that of property, though in practice, treatment varied widely. Some slaves were well treated, part of the household, eventually freed or allowed to marry and raise families. Others were worked brutally, especially in mining or heavy agricultural labour. Christianity did not immediately end slavery, though the church encouraged manumission as a pious act and forbade the enslavement of Christians by Christians, at least in theory. The wealth flowing into the kingdom supported Clovis's military ambitions. Warriors needed equipment, food, payment in coin or goods. Campaigns required logistics, supply trains, siege equipment. Diplomacy required gifts, bribes, the ability to impress foreign envoys with displays of wealth. The construction of churches required resources, both materials and skilled labour. All of this depended on the kingdom's ability to generate surplus, to extract resources from the land and from trade, to concentrate wealth in royal hands for redistribution and expenditure. Clovis understood, perhaps intuitively, the relationship between economic prosperity and military power. A wealthy kingdom could field large armies, equip them well, sustain campaigns over months or years. A poor kingdom, no matter how brave its warriors, would eventually lose to a wealthier opponent who could simply outlast them. The fertility of Frankish soil, the productivity of Frankish workshops, the flow of trade through Frankish territories, all of this translated into power, into the ability to shape events, to impose will on rivals and enemies. The earth gave up its wealth, and that wealth, properly used, built a kingdom. You stand in the Great Hall. You stand in the Great Hall of the King's Palace, though to call it a palace in the Roman sense would be misleading. It is a long building, timber-framed with wattle and daub walls, its roof thatched with reeds. But it is large, far larger than any common house, and it has been built with care and decorated with what wealth can purchase. The walls are hung with tapestries, wool woven in geometric patterns of red and blue and gold. Shields hang on the walls as well, the shields of warriors who have distinguished themselves in the king's service, each painted with its owner's device. Torches burn in iron brackets, supplementing the light that filters through the smoke hole in the roof. The hall is crowded tonight. Feast nights bring everyone together, from the greatest warriors to the humblest servants. You can smell the feast before you see it. Roasted meat, the heavy rich smell of pork and venison, fresh bread, yeasty and warm, beer, sharp and slightly sour, wood smoke from the great fire burning in the central hearth, and underneath it all, the smell of many bodies pressed close together, leather and wool and human sweat. The noise is tremendous. Warriors laugh and shout, their voices raised in boasts and challenges and jokes. Dogs bark and scrabble for scraps on the rush-covered floor. Servants move through the press of bodies, carrying platters and pitchers, dodging elbows and outstretched legs. Somewhere in the far corner, a harp plays, though you can barely hear it over the general din. The sound of the harp rises and falls, a thread of music woven through the chaos. You move closer to the high table, where Clovis sits with his queen and his most important warriors. The king's chair is larger than the others, its arms carved with interlaced animals, Germanic designs that speak of craft and wealth. Clovis himself looks every inch a king, though he is younger than you might expect, only in his 30s. His hair flows long and free, marking his royal status, and you can see gold thread woven into it, glinting in the firelight. He wears a tunic of fine linen, dyed purple, a colour that speaks of imperial connections and high status. Around his neck hangs a golden torque, massive and ornate, worth more than a farm. Clotilde sits beside him, dignified and watchful. She wears Roman-style clothing, a long dress of silk, pale green in colour, belted at the waist with a chain of gold. Her hair is covered with a veil, as Christian propriety demands, but you can see dark hair escaping at the edges, coiled and pinned. She does not eat or drink as freely as the warriors around her. She maintains a certain reserve, a reminder that royal women occupied a different space, observed different proprieties. The food arrives in waves. Whole roasted pigs, their skin crackling and brown. Venison haunches, the meat falling from the bone. Platters of fowl, ducks and geese and chickens. Fish too, pike from the rivers, their flesh white and flaky. Bread is piled high, round loaves dark with rye or pale with wheat. There are vegetables as well, though these are less prized. Onions and leeks, turnips and parsnips, beans cooked with bacon. Fruit comes later, apples and pears, dried figs that have travelled from the Mediterranean. The drink flows as freely as the food. Beer in large pottery vessels, passed from hand to hand. Mead, honey-sweetened, golden in colour, stronger and sweeter than beer. Wine for those at the high table, imported from the south, served in glass vessels that refract the light into rainbow colours. You watch as warriors drain their cups and call for more, as the level of intoxication rises, as inhibitions fall away. A warrior stands, swaying slightly, and begins to recite his deeds in battle. He fought at Tolbiac, he claims, stood in the shield wall when the Alemanni pressed hardest, killed 3 men with his own hand. Others cheer or jeer, depending on whether they believe the tale or think it exaggerated. Another warrior challenges the first, claiming his own deeds were greater. The boasting continues, each man trying to outdo the last, seeking recognition, status, the approval of peers and king. Clovis watches it all with an expression that gives nothing away. He has seen these displays before. He knows how to manage warrior pride, when to praise and when to deflect, when to let men blow off steam and when to impose order. He lifts his cup and drinks, a signal that the feast continues, that the night is still young, that there is time yet for eating and drinking, and the rough fellowship of the war band. You feel the heat of the fire on your face, smell the grease and smoke, hear the laughter and arguments swirling around you. This is power, you realise. Not just the gold and the weapons and the land, but this gathering, this assembly of warriors, bound to the king by oaths and gifts and shared experience. This is what holds the kingdom together. Not laws written on parchment, not administrative structures borrowed from Rome, but this, the personal relationship between king and warriors, renewed and reinforced in halls like this one, feast after feast, season after season, as long as the king remained strong enough to command loyalty and generous enough to reward it. Brothers in blood, Clovis had rivals among his own kin, as was common in Germanic society where kingship was partially elective, and any member of the royal family might make a claim to power. The most dangerous of these rivals was not a stranger but blood of his blood, a kinsman whose exact relationship to Clovis, and the sources do not make entirely clear, but who shared the Merovingian lineage, and therefore the sacred right to wear long hair and claim royal status. Ragnacar was his name. He had fought alongside Clovis at Soissons in the early days, when Clovis was still consolidating his position. He ruled his own territory, centred on the town of Cambrai, with his own warriors and his own court. For years, he was an ally, or at least not an open enemy, but as Clovis grew stronger, as his territory expanded and his reputation increased, the existence of other Merovingian kings became a problem. A kingdom cannot have two kings without eventually coming into conflict. The question was not whether Clovis would move against his kinsman, but when and how. Clovis began with subversion. He sent gifts to Ragnacar's warriors, gold armbands and fine weapons, more generous than what their own king could provide. He sent messages suggesting that a warrior's loyalty should be to the strongest king, to the one who could offer the greatest rewards. He cultivated relationships, identified the ambitious and the discontented, turned them slowly from Ragnacar's service to his own. It was patient work, requiring time and resources, but Clovis had both. When Clovis finally marched against Cambrai, Ragnacar's warriors melted away. Some openly defected to Clovis. Others simply refused to fight, standing aside as the confrontation approached. Ragnacar, seeing himself betrayed, tried to rally his remaining followers, but the situation was hopeless. He was captured without significant bloodshed, bound and brought before Clovis. The confrontation between the two men must have been terrible. They were family. They had fought together. They shared the sacred blood of Merovech. But Clovis had long since proven willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. "Why have you disgraced our family by allowing yourself to be bound?" Clovis asked. "It would have been better for you to die." Then Clovis struck Ragnacar down with his own hand, splitting his skull with an axe. The kinsman, who had been an ally and rival, fell dead at Clovis's feet. Ragnacar had a brother named Richard. Clovis ordered him killed as well, to prevent any future claims or vengeance attempts. With both brothers dead, their territory passed to Clovis, their warriors swearing oaths to the surviving king. The consolidation of Frankish power under a single ruler took a significant step forward. Purchased with family blood, there were others. Chararic, another Frankish king whose territory lay somewhere in the north, had made the mistake of remaining neutral during one of Clovis's campaigns, watching from a distance to see which side would win before committing his own forces. Clovis did not forget or forgive. When the opportunity came, he attacked Chararic's territory, captured both the king and his son, and had them tonsured, their long hair cut short in humiliation. They were placed in monasteries, their royal status stripped away, their political futures ended. But the story did not end there. Clovis heard that Chararic and his son were lamenting their fate, saying their hair would grow back, that they would emerge from the monasteries and reclaim what had been taken. The report may have been true, or may have been fabricated by enemies of the imprisoned kings. Either way, Clovis took no chances. He ordered both Chararic and his son executed. Their heads were struck off. The line was ended. The territory was absorbed. These killings were brutal, but not unusual by the standards of the time. Germanic society accepted that rivals had to be eliminated, that mercy to a defeated enemy was often foolishness that would come back to haunt the merciful. Clovis was creating a unified Frankish kingdom from a patchwork of tribal territories that required eliminating alternative centres of power, other men who could claim royal blood and therefore royal rights. He did what he thought necessary, and if later generations judged him harshly for it, well, later generations had not faced the choices he faced. Gregory of Tours, writing a century after these events, records that Clovis lamented after killing his kinsman. "Woe to me," Clovis supposedly said, "who have remained as a stranger among foreigners, and have none of my kinsmen to give me aid if adversity comes." But Gregory also notes that Clovis said this, not because he grieved for the dead, but because he hoped to draw out any other relatives who might still be alive and hiding, so that he could kill them too. Whether this anecdote is true or invention, it captures something essential about Clovis. He was a man who understood power, who knew that sentimental attachment to family was a luxury a king could not afford. He had seen what happened to kingdoms divided among multiple rulers. He had seen how quickly allies became rivals, how kinship meant little when ambition and opportunity called. He had chosen to create a unified kingdom, ruled by a single strong king, and he had paid the price in blood and guilt, and the elimination of everyone who might challenge that vision. By the end of this phase of consolidation, Clovis ruled all the Frankish tribes, the Salian Franks, who had been his inheritance, the Ripuarian Franks along the Middle Rhine, the scattered territories of Ragnachar, Chararic, and others whose names have been lost or garbled in transmission. The Franks were one people, under one king. It had required violence, it had required betrayal. It had required the killing of kinsmen and the breaking of oaths, but it was done, and that unity, however brutally achieved, would be Clovis's legacy to his successors, for better and for worse, the four sons. Clovis died in the year 511. He was perhaps 45 years old, still young by modern standards, but old enough for a warrior king in an age of violence and short life expectancies. He had reigned for 30 years. He had transformed the Franks from one tribe among many into the dominant power in Gaul. He had converted to Christianity and allied with the church. He had eliminated rival kings and unified Frankish territories under his sole rule. He had accumulated enormous wealth and considerable power. But he had not solved the problem of succession. Frankish custom dictated that a kingdom was the property of the king and should be divided among his sons, just as any other property would be divided among heirs. This was not the Roman system, where a single heir inherited the full imperium, nor was it the later feudal system, where primogeniture gave everything to the eldest son. It was a Germanic custom, egalitarian in intent, designed to give each son an equal share of the father's wealth and status. Clovis had 4 sons who survived to adulthood, all born to Clotilde. Their names were Theuderic, Clodomir, Childebert, and Clothar. After Clovis's death, the kingdom was divided among them, not randomly or arbitrarily. Each received a portion that included productive territory, important cities, access to resources. Each became king of his own realm, with his own capital, his own court, his own warriors. But they were also brothers, sharing blood and heritage, theoretically united in defense of the Merovingian dynasty. Theuderic received the eastern territories, centered on Reims and Metz. Clodomir got the Loire Valley, with his capital at Orléans. Childebert ruled from Paris, controlling the Seine Valley. Clothar held the northwest, the original Salian Frankish territories, ruling from Soissons. The division seems almost mathematical in its precision, each brother receiving roughly equal portions, each capital a centre of Roman or Frankish power. The arrangement contained obvious tensions. 4 kings meant 4 sources of decision-making, 4 potentially conflicting ambitions, 4 sets of warriors whose loyalty was to their own king rather than to any larger Frankish unity. But it also had advantages. The brothers could cooperate when cooperation served their interests. They could support each other against external threats. They could present a united front to the outside world, even while competing internally for advantage. In the early years, cooperation dominated. The brothers campaigned together against the Burgundians, seeking to expand Frankish territory, and perhaps to avenge old slights against their mother's family. They cooperated in dealing with the Visigoths. They maintained diplomatic relations with each other, exchanging embassies, negotiating agreements, resolving disputes through discussion rather than warfare. The system seemed to be working, but beneath the surface, rivalries were developing. Competition for prestige and territory, disputes over boundaries, conflicts over the loyalty of warriors who moved from one brother's service to another's. Personal animosities that grew from years of proximity and comparison. The question was not whether conflict would erupt, but when and in what form. The trigger, when it came, involved the next generation. Clovis I died in battle, leaving behind 3 young sons. According to Frankish custom, these sons should have inherited their father's kingdom, dividing it among themselves when they came of age. But Childebert and Clothar saw an opportunity. With their brother dead and his sons still children, why not divide Clodomer's kingdom between themselves? Why allow the kingdom to fragment further when it could be consolidated? The details of what happened next are preserved by Gregory of Tours, and they are horrifying even by the brutal standards of the Merovingian age. Childebert and Clothar sent a message to their sister-in-law, Clodomer's widow, saying they wanted to raise the boys to kingship. The widow, trusting in family bonds, sent the children to their uncles. Then the uncles presented the widow with a choice. The boys could be tonsured, their hair cut short so they could never be kings, or they could be killed. She chose death, reasoning that it was better for her sons to die as potential kings than to live as commoners. The 2 uncles murdered their nephews themselves, killing children to seize territory. Only the youngest escaped, hidden by loyal servants, and eventually entering a monastery as Clodewald, later venerated as Saint Cloud. The kingdom of Orleans was divided between Childebert and Clothar. The fragmentation Clovis had feared was temporarily forestalled, but at a cost that revealed the limits of family loyalty and the depths to which royal ambition could sink. This pattern would repeat throughout Merovingian history. Kingdoms divided among heirs, temporary cooperation giving way to conflict, uncles murdering nephews, brothers betraying brothers, cousins locked in struggle for advantage. The Frankish custom of partible inheritance, combined with the ruthlessness of men who saw power as the highest good, created a system that was inherently unstable, always tending toward fragmentation or consolidation through violence. Yet somehow it endured. The Merovingian dynasty would rule for another 240 years after Clovis's death, through civil wars and assassinations, through weak kings and strong queens, through periods of unity and periods of chaos. The long hair remained the symbol of legitimate authority. The Merovingian name still commanded loyalty, but the kingdom Clovis had built would be repeatedly divided and reunified, each generation fighting the same battles, making the same mistakes, trapped in patterns established by the custom of their ancestors. Whispers of silk and gold. Trade did not end with Rome's fall. The networks frayed, but did not break entirely. Ships still sailed the Mediterranean, though less frequently and with greater risk. Merchant caravans still travelled the old Roman roads, though now they had to negotiate passage through multiple kingdoms, pay tolls to different lords, worry about bandits and unstable borders. The flow of goods slowed to a trickle compared to imperial times, but the trickle continued. From the east came silk, that miracle fabric woven from the cocoons of worms, light as air and strong as iron. The secret of silk production was still held by the Chinese and the Persians. Western Europeans could only buy it at enormous cost, paying for the product of a process they did not understand. Silk moved along the ancient routes, from China through Central Asia to Persia, from Persia to Syria, from Syria by ship to Constantinople, from Constantinople occasionally to the west. Each link in the chain added cost. By the time silk reached Francia, it was worth its weight in gold. The Merovingian kings draped themselves in silk when they could. It was a display of wealth and connection, proof that even in the forests of the north, far from the Mediterranean heartland, Frankish gold could command eastern luxury. Queens wore silk dresses. Kings wore silk cloaks over their armour. Churches received silk hangings for altars. Physical representations of the wealth their patrons commanded. To touch silk was to touch something exotic and precious, something that spoke of distances and mysteries and the wider world that still existed beyond the borders of the Frankish realm. Spices came as well, in small quantities, precious beyond measure. Pepper from India, each peppercorn, a tiny black sphere worth carefully weighing and accounting. Cinnamon, whose origin was unknown to Europeans, which arrived in bundles of bark that no one in Francia could identify with any certainty. Ginger, cloves, nutmeg, all the aromatics that gave food flavour and demonstrated the host's sophistication and wealth. These spices appeared at royal feasts, sprinkled sparingly, their scarcity making them status symbols as much as ingredients. Wine travelled north from the Mediterranean, from the Rhone Valley, where Burgundian vineyards produced excellent vintages, from further south, where Visigothic territories yielded different varieties. The Franks were developing their own vineyards, especially in river valleys, where the climate was favourable, but Mediterranean wine still commanded premium prices. It came in amphoras, those distinctive clay vessels with pointed bottoms and twin handles, marked with symbols indicating their origin and sometimes their vintage. To serve wine from the south was to demonstrate membership in a wider world of taste and culture. Glass came from the east as well, though some was now being produced in Francia itself. The art of glass blowing had not been lost, though the quality varied. The finest glass, clear and thin, decorated with threads of colour or gold leaf trapped between layers, came from Syria or Egypt. Merovingian craftsmen produced serviceable vessels, often greenish or brownish in tint. Functional, if not beautiful. Glass beads were popular for jewellery, especially beads of bright blue or red, used to adorn necklaces and bracelets. Ivory was carved into elaborate works, boxes with Christian scenes in relief, combs decorated with interlaced animals, book covers for precious manuscripts. The ivory came from Africa, from elephants hunted in regions far to the south, beyond the known world of Mediterranean civilization. It arrived as tusks and was worked by craftsmen who had learned the techniques in Roman times and preserved them through the chaos of imperial collapse. The Franks exported goods in return, though these were less exotic. Slaves, always slaves, captured in war or purchased from other tribes, human beings sold like cattle, marched in chains to distant markets, their labour enriching buyers and sellers alike. Furs from the northern forests, beaver and marten and fox, prized for their warmth and luxury. Weapons, as mentioned, Frankish metalwork having a reputation for quality. Amber from the Baltic, that fossilised resin valued for its beauty and its supposed magical properties. These trade goods moved along fragile networks, dependent on political stability and royal protection. When kings cooperated, trade flourished. When they warred, merchants suffered, their goods seized, their persons endangered. The Merovingian kings understood dimly that trade benefited their kingdoms, that merchants brought wealth that could be taxed, that goods from distant lands enhanced royal prestige. But they also saw merchants as sources of immediate gain, to be plundered when convenient, protected when it served their interests. The silks and spices whispered of a larger world. They reminded the Frankish elite that their kingdom, however dominant in Western Europe, was provincial compared to Constantinople or Persia. They created appetites for more, driving the accumulation of wealth, the expansion of territory, the wars and raids that brought in plunder and slaves. They connected Francia to older and richer civilizations, creating cultural exchange along with commercial exchange, bringing ideas and styles and technologies, along with cloth and condiments. The trickle of trade kept the Franks from complete isolation, kept them aware that the world was larger than their forests and fields, kept alive the memory that they were heirs, however distant, to civilizations that had mastered arts and crafts. The Franks were only beginning to recover. Cities they built. The Merovingians did not build cities from nothing in the way that Romans had built cities, laying out forums and amphitheatres and bath complexes according to geometric plans. They inherited cities, Roman foundations with Roman bones, and they adapted them to their own purposes, transforming them slowly from centres of imperial administration into centres of Christian worship and Germanic kingship. But in that transformation, in that long, slow process of adaptation and change, they created something distinctively Merovingian, a hybrid urban culture that would shape the landscape of Northern Europe for centuries. Paris was perhaps their greatest achievement. though it began as a Roman town called Lutetia, established on an island in the Seine. The Romans had bridged the river there, built roads radiating outward, created a settlement that controlled river traffic and land routes alike. When the empire fell, Paris diminished. The population shrank. The stone buildings fell into disrepair. The great structures of imperial rule, the bathhouses and temples, lost their purpose and were gradually stripped of materials for other uses. Clovis chose Paris as one of his principal residences, recognizing its strategic location. He built a palace there, or rather adapted existing structures to serve as a palace. He founded churches, most notably the Church of the Holy Apostles, later rededicated to Saint Geneviève, the patron saint of Paris, who had supposedly saved the city from Attila's Huns through prayer and fortitude. When Clovis died, he was buried in that church, establishing it as a royal mausoleum. His successors would follow his example, making Paris increasingly important as a symbol of Merovingian power. The city grew slowly around these royal and religious foundations. New churches rose on the sites of old Roman temples. The palace expanded, adding buildings for administration, for royal residence, for storage of the ever-growing royal treasury. Markets were established on both banks of the Seine, drawing merchants and craftsmen. The population gradually increased, as people were drawn to where power and wealth concentrated. Paris was becoming not just a city, but the heart of what would eventually become France. Tournai, where Childeric was buried, remained important through the early Merovingian period. It had been a Roman garrison town, positioned to control crossings of the Scheldt River. The Merovingians maintained it as a royal residence, one of several they moved between, according to season and political necessity. The cathedral, where Childeric's tomb was eventually discovered, became a centre of pilgrimage after the treasure was found, proof that the Merovingian dynasty had deep roots, that their claims to legitimacy stretched back to the moment when Rome still existed in the West. Soissons, capital of the Roman remnant that Clovis had conquered, became Clothar's capital when the kingdom was divided. It was a substantial city, with Roman walls still standing, capable of defence, positioned on major roads that made it a natural centre of administration. The Merovingians rebuilt churches there, expanded the palace complex, made it a worthy seat of royal power. When later historians tried to understand the Merovingian realm, Soissons appeared again and again in their sources, site of battles and councils, and the assembly where the famous Vase incident occurred. Reims held special significance as the site of Clovis's baptism. The cathedral where Bishop Remigius had poured water over the pagan king's head became sacred to the French monarchy. Later, French kings, centuries after the Merovingians had fallen, would journey to Reims to be crowned, maintaining a tradition that stretched back to that Christmas in 508. The city became synonymous with legitimate Christian kingship, a place where earth and heaven met, where secular power received divine sanction. Metz, in the east, became important to the Austrasian branch of the Merovingian family, the descendants who ruled the eastern portions of Francia. The city lay on the Moselle River, controlling routes into Germany, positioned to defend against threats from the Alemanni or other Germanic peoples. Churches multiplied there. Monasteries were founded. The aristocratic families who would eventually produce the Carolingian dynasty made Metz their base, building the local connections and accumulating the resources that would later allow them to challenge and eventually replace the Merovingians. These cities were not large by Roman standards or by later medieval standards. A Merovingian city might have a population of a few thousand, perhaps 10,000 for the largest. But they were centres nonetheless, concentrations of power and wealth and culture in a landscape that was otherwise overwhelmingly rural. They provided markets where agricultural surplus could be exchanged for craft goods. They housed bishops who preserved literacy and administered church property. They served as symbols, physical representations of the kingdom's strength and permanence. The Merovingians also maintained the Roman road system. After a fashion, the great paved highways fell into disrepair as resources for maintenance vanished. But they remained passable for foot and horse traffic. Royal messengers used them. Armies marched along them. Merchants travelled them, moving goods between cities and regions. The roads connected the Merovingian cities to each other and to the wider world, maintaining networks of communication and commerce that prevented complete fragmentation. Within the cities, change came gradually. The old Roman public spaces, the forums and amphitheatres, lost their original functions. Some were converted to new uses, some simply decayed. But the street grid often remained, the fundamental layout of the city persisting, even as individual buildings changed. Churches were built on the sites of temples. Palaces rose where administrative buildings had stood. Markets shifted location, but continued to serve the same basic purpose. The Merovingian city was a place of coexistence and synthesis. Germanic warriors walked streets laid out by Roman engineers. Latin inscriptions appeared on churches built in Germanic style. Gallo-Roman aristocrats served Germanic kings. The old and the new interpenetrated, creating something that was neither purely Roman nor purely Germanic, but distinctively Merovingian, a hybrid that would persist long after the dynasty itself had vanished. When we walk through Paris or Reims or Metz today, when we trace the ancient street patterns or visit the medieval cathedrals built on Merovingian foundations, we are walking through spaces the long-haired kings shaped, touching a legacy that endures in stone and name, and the fundamental organisation of urban space. You walk among ruins. You stand in a field in northern France, perhaps in Belgium, somewhere in that borderland region where the Franks first emerged from obscurity into history. The sun is setting, casting long shadows across the uneven ground. At first glance, this is simply farmland, a pasture where cattle graze, bounded by hedgerows and crossed by footpaths worn smooth by centuries of use. But if you look carefully, if you know what to look for, you can see the traces. There, a subtle rise in the ground, too regular to be natural. You walk toward it, your feet rustling through grass gone golden in the autumn light. As you draw closer, you realize you are standing on a burial mound, a barrow raised over a Merovingian grave 1300 years ago. The earth has settled, the mound has eroded. Farmers have ploughed around it for generations. But the basic structure remains, a swelling in the earth marking where someone important was laid to rest. You imagine the burial, a king perhaps, or a wealthy warrior, or a queen. The body would have been dressed in fine clothes, jewellery around the neck and wrists, weapons at the side if male, perhaps implements of weaving or household management if female. The grave goods would have been arranged carefully, everything needed for the journey to the afterlife, or simply to display in death the status achieved in life. Then earth was heaped over the grave, creating this mound, while mourners stood in a circle and spoke words now lost, prayers to gods, some of them still believed in, prayers to the Christian God others had accepted. You place your hand on the grass-covered earth. It is cool and slightly damp. Beneath your palm lies who knows what. The burial may have been robbed centuries ago, the treasure stolen, the bones scattered, or it may lie intact, waiting for archaeologists with their careful brushes and recording equipment, their ability to extract meaning from fragments. You will never know. The mound is protected now, recognized as a historical site, preserved for future study, or simply left in peace. Looking around, you spot other features in the landscape. Over there, a line of trees that follows no current property boundary, but marks where a Roman road once ran. Beyond that, a village church whose foundations might date to the Merovingian period, built on a site that was sacred even before the Franks arrived, perhaps a Roman temple before that, perhaps a Celtic holy place before that. The landscape is layered with history, each generation leaving marks that the next generation incorporates or ignores or builds over. You walk to the edge of the field, where a small stream runs, clear water flowing over stones. This stream has been here since before humans arrived in this region. Merovingian warriors watered their horses here. Roman soldiers drank from it. Celtic farmers knew its course and fished its length. And before them, in the deep past, the stream flowed through wilderness, indifferent to human presence or absence. It connects all the ages, a thread of continuity running through time. In a nearby museum, you have seen artifacts from this region. A Francisca, the throwing axe that gave the Franks their name, its blade still sharp after more than a millennium in the earth. A woman's brooch, decorated with garnets and gold. Cloisonné work of extraordinary delicacy. Glass beads from a necklace. Pottery shards. The corroded remains of a sword. Each object was someone's possession, valued and used, carried through life and deposited in death. Each tells a story if you know how to read it. But here, in the field, the stories are quieter. The earth keeps most of its secrets. What lies beneath the grass is hidden, preserved or destroyed by time and chance and the chemistry of soil and groundwater. You think about the hands that shaped these landscapes, that raised these mounds, that built these roads. Long dead now, gone beyond memory, surviving only in the traces they left, the marks in the earth, the artifacts in museums, the DNA they passed to descendants who mostly do not know or care about 13th century ancestors. The light is fading. The cattle have moved to the far end of the field. A bird calls from the hedgerow, a liquid sound in the evening stillness. You turn to leave, walking back along the path, but you carry with you the awareness that this quiet field is sacred ground, that beneath the ordinary surface lies the extraordinary past, that the Merovingians who seem so remote in written sources were here, in this place, leaving marks that persist, despite everything time can do to erase them. The art of gold work. The Merovingians were masters of metalwork, particularly the art of working gold and semi-precious stones into objects of stunning beauty and complexity. This was not simply craft. It was not mere decoration. It was a way of making visible the power and status of the wearer, of transforming wealth from abstract potential into concrete display, of creating objects that could serve as gifts to secure alliances or as offerings to gain divine favour. The Merovingian goldsmith was an artist and a technician, a person of high status who commanded resources and respect. The characteristic technique was cloisonné, from the French word for compartment. The goldsmith would create a base, usually of gold, but sometimes of bronze or silver for less expensive pieces. On this base, thin walls of gold or other metal were soldered upright, creating cells or compartments. These cells were then filled with cut stones, usually garnets but sometimes coloured glass or other materials. The stones were fitted precisely, ground to shape to fill the compartments exactly. The result was a surface of rich colour, the deep red of garnets contrasting with the yellow of gold, catching the light and throwing it back in complex patterns. The garnets themselves came from long distances. The finest garnets, deeply coloured and relatively free of inclusions, were imported from India or Sri Lanka, travelling along trade routes that stretched across continents. Lesser quality garnets could be found closer to home, in Bohemia or other European sources. But the Merovingians preferred the best, and they paid accordingly, valuing the stones not just for their beauty, but for their rarity and the distances they had travelled. Creating cloisonné work required extraordinary precision. The gold walls had to be soldered without disturbing adjacent cells. The stones had to be cut to fit perfectly, a task requiring both skill and patience. The backing had to be prepared to enhance the stone's colour, sometimes using gold foil that reflected light back through the translucent garnet. A single piece, a brooch, or a sword fitting might require days or weeks of work by a master craftsman and apprentices. The objects produced ranged from personal jewellery to functional items transformed into works of art. Women wore brooches to fasten their clothing, pairs of them connected by chains, decorated with cloisonné and granulation and filigree work. Men wore belt buckles and sword fittings, their weapons turned into displays of wealth and status. Kings wore crowns or diadems with cloisonné decoration. Horses were equipped with decorated harness fittings. Even ordinary objects, combs or boxes or utensils, might be decorated if their owner could afford it. The style was distinctive, immediately recognisable as Merovingian. Other cultures worked in cloisonné, but the Merovingian versions had their own aesthetic. They favoured certain motifs, interlaced animals, and geometric patterns. They used garnets in ways that created rhythmic patterns, alternating filled cells with empty ones to create checkerboard effects or more complex designs. They combined techniques, adding granulation, tiny balls of gold soldered to surfaces, or filigree, thin wires twisted into decorative patterns. The symbolism embedded in these objects is now mostly lost to us. We can appreciate the beauty and recognize the skill, but we cannot fully understand what these pieces meant to the people who wore them. The garnets may have had symbolic significance beyond their visual appeal. The animal motifs may have carried meanings we no longer recognize. The very act of wearing such jewelry was a statement, but about what exactly? Power, certainly. Wealth, obviously. But also perhaps connection to tradition, to ancestors who had worn similar pieces, to a cultural identity that was distinctively Merovingian. When archaeologists open Merovingian graves and find these treasures, often they are damaged by time. Gold survives well, but garnets may have fallen from their settings. Organic materials that once accompanied the metalwork, leather, or wood or textile, have usually decayed beyond recognition. What remains must be carefully cleaned, conserved, studied. Each piece is catalogued, photographed, analysed. Scholars compare pieces from different sites, looking for workshops that produce similar styles, for trade networks that distributed materials, for patterns of wealth distribution across the Merovingian realms. Museums now hold these treasures behind glass. You can see them, the brooches and buckles and sword fittings, arranged in cases with careful lighting that brings out the gold's warmth and the garnet's depth. But you cannot touch them. You cannot feel the weight of a golden brooch in your hand. You cannot pin it to your clothing and feel it pull at the fabric. You cannot wear it as it was meant to be worn, moving through the world with this declaration of status visible to all who saw you. The art of Merovingian goldwork died with the dynasty, or rather, it evolved into new forms as styles changed and new influences arrived. The Carolingians who replaced the Merovingians had their own aesthetic preferences. The techniques persisted, but were applied to different forms, different motifs. The characteristic Merovingian style, that particular combination of cloisonné garnets and gold and interlaced animals, became a thing of the past, preserved only in the graves of the long dead, and in the museums where their treasures now rest. In the bee's shadow. In the year 1804, a man who had risen from Corsican obscurity to rule France prepared for his coronation as emperor. Napoleon Bonaparte, general and consul and now emperor designate, understood the power of symbols. He understood that legitimacy required more than military victory and political maneuvering. It required connection to the past, to traditions that transcended individual ambition, to symbols that resonated with deeper meanings. His advisors searched history for appropriate imperial symbols. The fleur-de-lis was associated with the Bourbon monarchy he had displaced. The eagle was Roman, certainly imperial, but perhaps too obvious, too borrowed. Then someone remembered the golden bees from Childric's tomb, those 300 insects that had lain with the first Merovingian king for 11 centuries before their discovery. The bees spoke to Napoleon in a language he understood. They were ancient, older than the Capetians, older than the Carolingians, reaching back to the very foundation of French monarchy. They were distinctively French, native to this soil, unique to this history. They were beautiful, the craftsmanship evident, even to eyes, 1,300 years removed from their creation. And they were royal, unquestionably royal, found in a king's tomb, associated with the sacred beginnings of the nation. Napoleon ordered the bees incorporated into his imperial symbolism. They appeared on his coronation robes, embroidered in gold thread, scattered across the rich fabric like stars across a firmament. They appeared on carpets and tapestries. They decorated the columns of his palace. They were stamped on official documents and woven into banners. Everywhere Napoleon's power was displayed, the bees of Childeric accompanied it, silent testimony to continuity stretching across the centuries. The scholars of Napoleon's time debated what the bees had meant to Childeric. Some argued they were not bees at all, but cicadas, insects associated with immortality in Mediterranean symbolism. Others insisted they were flies, Germanic symbols whose meaning had been lost. Still others maintained they were indeed bees, representing industriousness, organization, the ordered hierarchy of the hive with its queen and workers. Napoleon did not care particularly about these scholarly debates. He cared that they were ancient, royal, and French. The irony, of course, was that Napoleon was neither ancient nor particularly French by blood. He was a newcomer, an outsider who had seized power through talent and ruthlessness. But that made the symbols more important, not less. He needed to demonstrate that his rule was not aberration but restoration, not revolution but return to authentic roots. The Merovingian bees served that purpose perfectly. When Napoleon fell, when the Bourbon monarchy was restored, the bees were put away, replaced once again by fleurs-de-lis, but they had had their moment. They had flown again, after a fashion, carried not on the clothing of long-haired kings, but on the coronation robes of an emperor who claimed descent not from Merovech but from the revolution and the rights of man. The connection was spurious, historically questionable, but symbolically powerful. Today, if you visit the Louvre or other museums that hold what remains of Childerick's treasure, you can see a few of the original bees. Many were stolen in the theft of 1831 and never recovered. Some were melted down for their gold. Some remain in private collections, dispersed and lost to public view. But enough survive to give you a sense of what Napoleon saw, why he was drawn to these tiny golden insects, what he thought they could add to his claim to rule France. They are smaller than you might expect, delicate. Each wing is articulated, each segment of the body defined. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Whoever made these bees in the 5th or 6th century after Christ was a master goldsmith, capable of working at minute scale with precision and artistry. They catch the light differently from different angles, seeming almost to move, almost to buzz with the life they represent. The bees of Childeric, scattered across Napoleon's robes, became a symbol of France's oldest depths, of continuity beneath change, of legitimacy drawn from sources so ancient that no one could fully understand them anymore. They were Merovingian and imperial and revolutionary all at once, meaning different things to different people, but always speaking to power, to the weight of history, to the way the distant past continues to shape the present in ways both obvious and subtle. They were, in the end, proof that the Merovingians had not entirely vanished, that their legacy persisted in unexpected forms, reappearing centuries after their dynasty ended, to serve the ambitions of an emperor who had probably never heard of Clovis, but knew instinctively that the ancient symbols still held power, names upon the land. The Merovingians live on in language, in the names that mark the landscape of France and Belgium and Western Germany, in the words people speak without knowing their ancient origins. Language is conservative, preserving fragments of the past long after the political structures that produce them have vanished. In the place names and personal names of modern Europe, you can trace the outline of the Merovingian world if you know where to look. France itself. The word derives from the Franks. Francia was their kingdom, the land of the Frankish people. As centuries passed and the population became increasingly Romanized, speaking Romance languages instead of Germanic tongues, the name persisted. The Franks themselves were absorbed into the larger population, their language lost, their customs transformed beyond recognition. But the name endured. To speak of France is to invoke the Franks, to carry forward a name given by Germanic warriors who conquered this land 1300 years ago. Paris, as we have seen, was Lutetia to the Romans, but the Parisii, the Celtic tribe who inhabited the region before Roman conquest, gave the city its later name. The Merovingians did not rename it. They simply adopted the existing name and made it the heart of their power. Now it is one of the most famous city names in the world, spoken daily by millions, its origins in a long-vanished Celtic tribe mostly forgotten. Reims, Soissons, Tournai, Metz. All these cities carry names that predate the Merovingians, Roman or Celtic or Germanic in origin. But the Merovingians transformed them, gave them new significance, made them royal cities whose names would echo through history. To say Reims is to evoke not just a modern city, but 13 centuries of French coronations beginning with Clovis. To say Soissons is to remember a vase and a warrior who challenged a king and the price of that challenge. Many French place names contain elements that are Frankish in origin. Names ending in court or ville often contain Germanic elements. though overlaid with French pronunciation and spelling. The word Frank appears in place names, marking lands that were free from certain taxes or obligations, a usage that goes back to the Frankish concept of freedom as embodied in the tribe's very name. Personal names show even clearer Frankish influence. Louis, the name of 18 French kings, is the French form of Clovis, which itself derives from the Frankish Clovis. Charles, another royal name, comes from the Germanic Karl. These names and dozens of others, Robert and Richard and William, names so common in French and English that they seem timeless, actually originated in the Germanic languages spoken by the Franks and their neighbours. The language of French itself, though a Romance language descended from Latin, contains a substrate of Frankish words that entered the vocabulary during the Merovingian period and remained. Military terms particularly show this influence. Words related to war, weapons, organisation. Many of these have Germanic roots, reflecting the dominance of Frankish warriors in the military hierarchy. The Frankish language itself died out, replaced by the evolving Romance speech of the Gallo-Roman majority. But fragments remained embedded in French, permanent borrowings that enrich the language and preserve some memory of the Germanic conquerors. Legal terms show Frankish influence as well. The concept of feudalism, which would dominate European society for centuries, had Germanic roots in the relationship between lord and warrior, in the personal bonds that held the Frankish warband together. Words related to these relationships, to oaths and loyalty and service, often trace back to Frankish origins, even as they evolved to describe the more complex hierarchies of later medieval society. In Belgium, the linguistic divide between French-speaking Wallonia and Dutch-speaking Flanders roughly corresponds to the ancient division between more Romanized southern territories and more Germanic northern regions. The Merovingians ruled both, but the underlying cultural differences persisted through their reign and beyond, eventually producing the linguistic split visible today. To understand Belgium's complex linguistic politics, you need to reach back to the Merovingian period and earlier, to the patterns of settlement and conquest that shaped the region. Germany's western regions, the Rhineland and areas adjacent, preserve memory of the Franks as well. Frankish dialects contributed to the development of modern German, particularly in the West. Place names and personal names in these regions often show continuities, reaching back to the Merovingian period. The Franks who remained east of the Rhine maintained their Germanic speech, even as their Western cousins were absorbed into Romance-speaking populations, but they remained conscious of their identity as Franks, as people connected to the kingdoms and dynasties that had ruled the West. To walk through France or Belgium or Western Germany is to walk through a landscape shaped by the Merovingians in ways both obvious and subtle. The cities they chose as capitals remain important. The boundaries they established, though modified endlessly by subsequent political changes, influenced the shapes of later territories. The roads they maintained, originally Roman but kept passable through Merovingian efforts, often underlie modern highways. The names they used or adapted or created persist on maps and in daily speech. The Merovingians are gone. Their language is dead. Their political structures have long since been replaced. But they left their mark on the landscape and the language in ways that cannot be erased. Every time someone says France or Paris or Louis, they invoke the Merovingian legacy, whether they know it or not. The names endure, carrying forward fragments of the past into an ever-receding present, testifying to the persistence of linguistic forms long after the cultures that created them have been transformed beyond recognition. The blood remains. In the year 2013, scientists published the results of genetic studies conducted on DNA extracted from Merovingian burials. Using techniques that would have seemed like magic to the long-haired kings, researchers analysed ancient genetic material, comparing it to modern populations, tracing lineages across the centuries. The results were complex and ambiguous in some respects, but they confirmed what historians had long suspected. The Merovingians did not vanish, they were absorbed. The genetic evidence shows mixing between Germanic and Gallo-Roman populations, beginning in the Merovingian period and continuing afterward. The conquerors and the conquered intermarried, their children inheriting DNA from both sides, gradually blending until the distinction between Frank and Roman became meaningless. By the 9th or 10th century, the population of northern France was thoroughly mixed, neither Germanic nor Roman, but a combination of both, speaking a Romance language, but carrying genetic markers from across Europe. This should not surprise us. Political conquest rarely means complete population replacement. The Franks were always a minority, albeit a dominant minority, among a larger Gallo-Roman population. Intermarriage was common, even encouraged after Clovis's conversion removed religious barriers. Frankish warriors took Roman wives. Roman aristocrats married into Frankish families. The children of these unions moved in both worlds, maintaining connections to both traditions. Merovingian royal DNA is particularly interesting. The dynasty itself ended in 751, when Childeric III was deposed and tonsured, but the family did not die out entirely. Cadet branches, relatives of the kings who never held the throne themselves, continued. Some entered the church, their bloodlines ending in holy celibacy. Others married and had children, passing on their genetic heritage even as their political significance vanished. Tracing Merovingian ancestry in modern populations is difficult because medieval genealogical records are incomplete and often unreliable. Many families claim descent from the Merovingians, from Clovis or his brothers or more distant relatives. Some of these claims are well documented, others are spurious, medieval inventions designed to provide noble families with impressive pedigrees. Still others may be true but unprovable, family traditions passed down orally without supporting documentation. What genetic studies can tell us is that people living in France, Belgium, and Western Germany today carry DNA from populations that were present in the Merovingian period. They are, in a very real sense, descendants of the Franks and the Gallo-Romans both. The blood remains, mixed and diluted by centuries of subsequent migrations and marriages, but present nonetheless. The Merovingians live on in the bodies of their distant descendants, their genetic legacy scattered across millions of people who mostly do not know and probably do not care about their 13th century ancestors. There is something both profound and trivial about this genetic continuity. Profound because it confirms that the past is not truly past, that we carry it in our very cells, that the decisions and actions of people 13 centuries dead shaped who exist today and who does not. Trivial because genetic descent means little without cultural continuity, without some transmission of values or knowledge or identity from one generation to the next. A French person today may carry Merovingian DNA, but speaks a language the Merovingians would not recognize, follows customs they never practiced, believes in ideologies they could not have imagined. The Merovingians believed that blood mattered enormously. Royal blood, in particular, carried quasi-magical significance. The long hair was a visible sign of that special blood, the inheritance that made kingship possible. To be Merovingian was to belong to a family set apart by divine favour or ancient magic or simple hereditary right. The blood was power, and power was blood. Modern genetics suggests a different picture. Blood, in the sense of inherited DNA, is simply chemistry, complex molecular structures that code for physical characteristics and predispositions. It conveys no right to rule. It carries no sacred quality. The Merovingians were genetically similar to their Gallo-Roman subjects, both populations carrying the mixed heritage of centuries of movement and interaction across Europe. What made the Merovingians special was not their blood, but their history, their ability to seize and hold power, their legacy of conquest and conversion, and political innovation. Yet there remains something compelling about the idea of continuity through blood. Somewhere in France, Belgium, Germany, perhaps in unexpected places, people go about their lives carrying fragments of Merovingian DNA, and they may be teachers or shopkeepers, or farmers or office workers. They may have no interest in history whatsoever. But in their cells are molecules inherited from warriors who fought at Tolbiac, from queens who plotted murders, from kings whose long hair marked them as sacred. The connection is real, even if its significance is uncertain. The Merovingian legacy lives on in names and places and political structures, but it also lives on in the most fundamental way, in the genetic material passed from generation to generation slowly modified by mutation and mixing, but preserving some signature of the deep past. The blood remains, transformed beyond anything the Merovingians would recognize, but still carrying forward some echo of who they were, what they did, the world they shaped and were shaped by. Stones in silent fields, evening comes to the burial grounds, that golden hour when the sun hangs low and everything glows with amber light. The stones, whether natural boulders or carved markers raised in later centuries to commemorate half-forgotten burials, cast long shadows across the grass. The mounds, eroded by 1,300 years of weather, rise gently from the surrounding land, curves in the earth that speak of human intention in a landscape otherwise shaped by wind and water. Nothing moves except the grass, bending in the breeze, creating patterns of light and shadow as the wind passes over the field. You can hear it, that wind, a susurration like distant voices, like whispers in an unknown language. The grass rustles. Leaves turn on the trees at the field's edge. Somewhere far off, a bird calls, a melancholy sound perfectly suited to the fading light. The earth here is sacred, or was sacred once. Beneath the grass lie bones, jewellery, weapons, all the grave goods placed with care by mourners who believed the dead would need such things on their journey. Time has worked its alchemy on those burials. The organic materials, cloth and leather and wood, have mostly vanished, returned to soil. The bones have turned to minerals, fossils in their own small way. The metal endures, corroded or pristine depending on the chemistry of local conditions, waiting for the archaeologist's careful excavation, or doomed to remain forever buried. The stones stand witness. Some are recent 19th century markers placed when antiquarians became interested in Merovingian sites, when local historical societies raised monuments to indicate where important burials had been found. Others are older, medieval perhaps, placed when memory of the original burials was already fading, but some sense of the ground's sanctity persisted. Still others are truly ancient, megalithic stones that predate the Merovingians by millennia, marking places that were sacred before the Franks arrived, that remained sacred through their time, that continue to draw visitors who sense something special about these fields. The light continues to fade. The amber glow deepens toward red, toward the purple of approaching dusk. The shadows lengthen until they merge, until the whole field is in shadow, except for the tops of the mounds, which catch the last rays of the sun and seem to glow from within. It is a trick of the light, nothing more, but it is effective. The burial mounds become beacons, markers between the living world and whatever lies beyond. Silence settles over the field as night approaches. The wind dies to a whisper. The birds fall quiet. Even the distant sounds of modern life, traffic on roads or aircraft overhead, seem to recede. For a moment, you could imagine yourself in the 6th century, standing in this same field as mourners raise a mound over a fallen king, as prayers are spoken to gods old or new, as the living perform the rituals that ease the dead into whatever comes next. Then the moment passes. The light fails completely. The mounds become merely dark shapes against a darkening sky. Stars begin to appear overhead, the same stars that shone on the Merovingians, on the Romans before them, on the Celts before them, on the anonymous peoples of the deep past who first settled these lands and buried their dead, and wondered, as all humans wonder, what death means and whether anything persists beyond it. The stones remain in the silent fields, keeping their vigil, marking the graves of the long dead. They will be here tomorrow and next year and next century, slowly weathering, slowly sinking back into the earth from which they were quarried or gathered. But for now, in this twilight moment, they stand as they have stood for centuries, testifying to human mortality and human hope, to the desire to be remembered and the inevitability of being forgotten, to the persistence of stone and the transience of flesh. The thread, unbroken, France exists because of the Merovingians. This is not hyperbole or nationalist mythology. It is a simple historical fact. Before the Merovingians, the territory we now call France was divided among multiple peoples, kingdoms, and cultures. The Romans had united it administratively, but that unity disappeared with the empire's collapse. The Visigoths held the south. The Burgundians held the east. Brittany was independent under its Celtic-speaking rulers. Smaller powers and local strongmen controlled various regions. There was no France, no unified political entity that encompassed these territories and gave them common identity. The Merovingians created that unity, or at least began the process. Clovis's conquests brought diverse territories under a single royal house. His conversion to Nicene Christianity gave that house legitimacy in the eyes of the Gallo-Roman population and the Church. His sons, despite dividing the kingdom among themselves, maintained the fiction of Merovingian unity, of a single kingdom temporarily partitioned, rather than permanently fragmented. And his distant successors, despite their political weakness, preserved the dynasty's claim to represent all the Frankish people. When the Merovingians finally fell, when Pippin the Short took the crown in 751 with papal blessing, the kingdom he took was recognisably the ancestor of modern France. It encompassed roughly the same territories. It had a similar administrative structure. It was Catholic, French-speaking in the developing Romance vernacular, centred on Paris and the Seine Valley. The Carolingians, Pippin, and his son Charlemagne and their successors built on Merovingian foundations. They expanded the kingdom, certainly, pushing into Germany and Italy, but the core remained what the Merovingians had created. The synthesis of Germanic and Roman elements that the Merovingians achieved became the foundation of medieval European civilization. The personal bonds of Germanic warrior culture provided the basis for feudalism. Roman administrative techniques and legal concepts provided the framework for governance. Christianity, in its Catholic form, has transmitted through the alliance between Merovingian kings and Gallo-Roman bishops, provided the cultural unity that transcended political fragmentation. This Merovingian synthesis spread beyond Francia itself, influencing the development of other European societies, creating patterns that would persist for centuries. The idea of sacred kingship, embodied in the long hair and the divine favour the Merovingians claimed, evolved into the medieval doctrine of the king's two bodies. The notion that a king was both a mortal man and the immortal embodiment of the realm. French coronations at Reims, continuing the tradition established when Clovis was baptised there, reinforced this idea. The king was not simply a political leader, but a sacred figure, chosen by God, anointed with holy oil, possessing quasi-priestly status. This conception of kingship, with its roots in Merovingian practice, shaped European political thought until the modern era. The Merovingian legacy includes the first stirrings of French national consciousness. The Franks, originally a Germanic tribe or confederation of tribes, became increasingly identified with the territory they ruled rather than with ethnic origins. By the later Merovingian period, to be Frankish was to inhabit Francia and live under Frankish law, regardless of whether your ancestors were Germanic or Gallo-Roman, or something else. This territorial, rather than purely ethnic identity, was crucial to the development of France as a nation. The alliance between throne and altar, between Merovingian kings and the Catholic Church, established patterns that would shape French history for more than a millennium. France became the Church's favoured secular power, the kingdom that protected the papacy, led crusades, built cathedrals, and saw itself as having a special mission to defend and spread the faith. This self-conception, rooted in Clovis's conversion and the subsequent Merovingian promotion of Catholic Christianity, influenced French foreign policy and cultural identity well into the modern era. Even the French Revolution, that great rupture with the past, that rejection of monarchy and aristocracy and church authority, could not entirely break the Merovingian thread. The revolutionaries knew they were overthrowing a system whose roots reached back 13 centuries. They knew that to transform France required grappling with its deepest traditions. Napoleon, as we have seen, reached back to those traditions, to the Merovingian symbols, seeking legitimacy in the ancient past, even as he claimed to represent the revolutionary future. Today, France is a republic, secular and democratic, seemingly far removed from the world of long-haired kings and baptisms at Reims. But the territory is recognisably the same. The capital is still Paris. The boundaries, much modified by subsequent history, still roughly correspond to the Merovingian heartland. The language, though evolved beyond recognition, still carries Frankish loanwords. The culture, that complex mix of Germanic and Roman and Christian elements, still shows the influence of the synthesis the Merovingians achieved. The thread runs unbroken from Childeric's tomb to the present day. Not a straight line, certainly. History never moves in straight lines, but a connection nonetheless, a chain of causation and inheritance, of influences passed from generation to generation, of structures and ideas and identities that persist even as they transform. The Merovingians created Francia. Francia became France. And France, despite revolutions and wars and social transformations, remains recognizably the heir to what the long-haired kings began, what the earth remembers. Archaeology is an optimistic discipline, built on the faith that the earth remembers, even when human memory fails. Every year, new Merovingian sites are discovered. A construction project uncovers a burial ground. Erosion exposes artifacts that have been hidden for centuries. New technologies allow the re-examination of sites that were excavated decades ago with cruder methods. The Merovingians continue to emerge from the soil, revealing themselves to patient investigators who know how to read the fragmented evidence. Genetic analysis now allows us to extract information from bones that previous generations could only measure and describe. We can determine relationships between individuals buried in the same cemetery. We can trace population movements by comparing DNA from different sites and different periods. We can even sometimes determine diet and disease from chemical signatures in bones and teeth. The Merovingians, dead for 13 centuries, yield up secrets they did not know they possessed. Ground-penetrating radar and other remote sensing techniques reveal what lies beneath the surface, without excavation. Researchers can map entire cemeteries, identify buildings and roads and boundary ditches, all without disturbing the soil. When excavation does occur, it can be targeted precisely, focused on features identified through remote sensing, maximizing the information gained while minimizing the disturbance to archaeological resources. There are mysteries still unsolved, questions that await answers buried in the earth. Where exactly was Clovis baptized? The tradition says Reims Cathedral, but the current cathedral building is much later. Was there an earlier structure on the same site? Archaeological investigation could potentially reveal foundations, baptismal fonts, material evidence of that crucial moment. Similarly, where was Clovis buried? Gregory of Tours tells us it was in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Paris, but the exact location is uncertain. The church was destroyed centuries ago. Excavations might locate the site, might even find the royal burials, though the chances diminish with every passing century. What happened to the rest of Childeric's treasure? The theft of 1831 took much of it, and most of those stolen pieces were probably melted down for their gold. But could some survive in private collections, unrecognized or deliberately hidden? Might other royal burials contain similar treasures waiting to be discovered? Archaeology proceeds on hope as much as method, on the possibility that the next excavation will reveal something extraordinary. The Merovingian landscape itself remains incompletely understood. We know the locations of major cities and some rural settlements, but the countryside, where most people lived, is largely unknown to us. Field surveys and excavations gradually fill in the picture, revealing farmsteads and villages, patterns of land use, the economic foundations that supported the kings and their warriors. Each site adds a small piece to the larger puzzle. The earth is patient. It preserves what we give it, transforming organic materials back to soil but keeping the inorganic, the stone and metal and ceramic that resist decay. It waits for us to ask the right questions, to develop the right techniques, to look in the right places. And slowly, year by year, excavation by excavation, the Merovingian world becomes clearer, more detailed, more real. There is wonder in this process of discovery, in the moment when a trowel scrapes away soil to reveal a brooch or a coin or a fragment of bone. In that moment, the past and present touch. The archaeologist becomes the first person in 1300 years to see this object, to hold it, to wonder about the person who owned it, and the circumstances that brought it to rest in this particular spot. It is a privilege and a responsibility, requiring care and patience and respect for the dead whose lives we seek to understand. The earth remembers, not perfectly, not completely, but enough. Enough to keep revealing the Merovingians to us, to keep answering questions and raising new ones, to keep the past alive in fragments and traces, and the work of patient investigators who believe that every shovelful of soil might contain a story worth telling. We began tonight in darkness, standing in the year 1653, as workers unearthed the golden bees and treasures of Childeric. We have travelled through time, through the rise and fall of a dynasty, through baptisms and battles, and the slow transformation of a warrior people into the foundation of a nation. We have met kings with flowing hair and queens who wielded power as ruthlessly as any warrior. We have witnessed conversion and conquest, seen synthesis emerge from conflict, watched as Germanic and Roman cultures merged into something new. The Merovingians were not perfect. They were violent, often brutal, capable of terrible acts in pursuit of power. They murdered kinsmen. They broke oaths. They pursued ambition without much regard for the cost in human suffering, but they were also builders, creating structures that outlived them, making choices whose consequences shaped centuries. Clovis's decision to convert, made in desperation on a battlefield, changed the course of European history. The Merovingian synthesis of Germanic and Roman elements became the foundation of medieval civilization. Their world is gone now, transformed beyond recognition. The forests they knew have been cleared. The rivers they crossed flow through landscapes utterly changed. The cities they built as timber halls are now modern metropolises. The language they spoke is dead. The gods they first worshipped are forgotten, except by scholars. Even the church they served has evolved into forms they would not recognize, yet they persist in traces, in names on maps, in genetic material carried by distant descendants, in the shape of France itself, that nation they inadvertently created, in the stones that mark their graves, in the treasures preserved in museums, in the historical consciousness of a people who still sometimes remember that their origins lie with long-haired kings who ruled 13 centuries ago. The golden bees of Childeric, scattered on Napoleon's robes, flying once more after centuries in the earth, capture something essential about the Merovingian legacy. It is fragmentary, often misunderstood, repurposed by later generations for their own ends. But it is real. It is there. It connects the deep past to the present in ways both obvious and subtle. Tonight, you have walked with the Merovingians through their history. You have stood in morning mist in Frankish settlements. You have witnessed baptism and battle. You have felt the weight of gold and garnet jewellery. You have stood in fields where ancient burial mounds still rise from the grass. You have touched, however briefly, a world that existed and then passed away, leaving only fragments behind. May these historical reflections have brought you comfort and calm. Rest well beneath the starlit skies of ancient nights.